Good evening, and welcome back. Have you ever wondered what it might feel like to perceive the world not as you do now, through the narrow window of your 5 familiar senses, but through something wider, something older, something that hums just beneath the surface of ordinary awareness like a deep current beneath still water? Have you ever sat quietly in a dark room and felt, for just a moment, that you were almost remembering something enormous, something your mind could not quite hold, as though a door were briefly ajar and then, before you could step through, it eased shut again? If this channel brings you peace and quiet wonder on nights like this one, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, not because of any obligation, but only if you find that this is a place where your mind rests well. Drop a comment below with where you are in the world tonight, and what time it is where you sit or lie. There is something quietly beautiful about knowing that people in 100 different time zones are resting together in the same slow story. Go ahead now and dim the lights if you have not already. Perhaps turn on a fan, or let a window sit open just enough to bring in the soft sounds of the night. Settle your body, let your shoulders drop, and breathe a little more slowly than you have been breathing all day. Now let us ease into tonight's journey together. The land we are entering tonight is very old. It is older than the names we have given it, older than the borders drawn across it by later empires, older even than the first marks pressed into wet clay by the earliest hands that thought to record what they had seen and heard and believed. It is the land between 2 rivers, the flat and generous plain that stretches between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the soil is dark and deep and smells, in the early morning, of something between rain and bread. This is where our story begins. Not with gods descending from the sky, not yet, but with the land itself, patient and ancient, waiting. Picture the plain as it looked in the deepest layers of human prehistory, before the first mud brick was laid, before the first irrigation channel was dug, before the first city rose from the flat earth like a slow exhalation. The rivers ran wide and unpredictable in those early centuries, carving new paths through the alluvial soil after each season of flood, depositing layers of rich silt along their banks, and then retreating again into their channels, leaving behind a darkness in the earth that was almost miraculous in its fertility. Along the margins of these rivers, reeds grew in great dense stands, their tall pale stalks clicking softly in the wind, home to birds that nested in thousands, to fish that moved in silver flashes through the shallows, to insects that rose in clouds at dusk and settled again before the stars fully appeared. The earliest people who moved through this landscape were not farmers. They were gatherers and hunters, moving with the seasons, reading the sky and the water and the behaviour of animals the way a later generation would read letters on a page. They knew which reeds could be woven into baskets tight enough to carry water, which could be shaped into the hulls of small boats, which could be burned for warmth without producing a smoke so thick it stung the eyes. They knew the high water season by the colour of the sky 3 days before the rains came. They knew which direction the wind carried the smell of the sea, and which direction it carried the smell of the open steppe. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in the body, in the hands, in the particular way a person tilted their head when listening for something far away. This is worth pausing on, even here at the very beginning of the story, because it is central to everything that will follow. These earliest inhabitants of the Mesopotamian plain possessed a kind of intelligence that was deeply integrated with the world around them. They did not stand apart from nature and observe it at a distance. They were woven into it. They could feel a change in pressure in the air that preceded weather by hours. They could smell water underground through the behaviour of certain plants. They could read the migration patterns of birds not merely as a guide to food, but as a kind of calendar, a map of time itself unfolding in predictable rhythms across the sky. Scholars who study the archaeological record of early Mesopotamia find traces of this integrated intelligence in the objects left behind. Bone tools shaped with extraordinary precision, pigments mixed and applied with a subtlety that suggests not just craft but intention, a reaching towards something beyond pure utility. Small carved figures whose proportions suggest a careful observation of the human form that goes far beyond what survival alone would require. These early people were paying attention. They were paying a very particular kind of attention, one that's difficult for the modern mind to fully reconstruct, because it assumed a permeability between the inner world and the outer one that most people today have largely lost the habit of feeling. As the millennia passed, and the climate of the ancient Near East shifted through its slow cycles of wet and dry, of cold and warmth, the people of the Mesopotamian plain began to settle more permanently along the river margins. The first permanent settlements were modest things, clusters of reed houses built on raised ground above the floodline, surrounded by the first tentative attempts at cultivated fields. Barley was among the earliest crops to take root in this landscape, its tough and yielding grain adaptable to the salt-touched soil near the river margins, capable of surviving the dry months with a kind of stubborn patience that the people who grew it must have recognized as a mirror of their own endurance. The early villages that grew along the Tigris and Euphrates were not yet the cities that would later astonish the ancient world. They were quiet places, intimate in scale, where everyone knew the name of every child, where disputes were settled by elders who sat in the shade of a wall and spoke slowly, and where the rhythm of the day was governed entirely by light and water, and the needs of crops and animals. A woman grinding grain in the early morning would have heard the same sounds every day of her life: the scratch of stone on stone, the low conversation of other women working nearby, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind moving through the reeds at the river's edge. Her world was small in its geography, but extraordinarily rich in its texture. Every sound meant something. Every smell carried information. The smoke from a particular hearth told you what that family was cooking, and therefore something about how their harvest had gone. The direction a flock of birds lifted from a field told you something about what was moving through the grasses at the field's edge. There was in this early world a quality of attentiveness that is hard to name precisely, but easy to feel when you try to imagine it. It was not mystical in the way the word is sometimes used, as though it implied something apart from ordinary life. It was, in fact, the most ordinary thing imaginable, the baseline condition of a mind that had not yet learned to filter out most of what the senses offered. These early people were not superhuman. They were simply unfiltered in ways that would later become difficult to sustain, as life grew more complex, more layered, more mediated by the structures of civilization itself. The geography of the Mesopotamian plain shaped everything about the culture that eventually arose from it. Unlike the mountain peoples to the north and east, who lived in a world of defined horizons and natural barriers, the people of the plain lived beneath an enormous sky that offered no visual interruption from horizon to horizon. The stars at night were visible in a way that is difficult for someone who has grown up beneath the light pollution of a modern city to fully imagine. They were not decorations on the edge of vision. They were overwhelming presences, so bright and numerous that the sky itself seemed to breathe with them, to pulse with a kind of cold, patient life. The Milky Way was not a faint smear, but a brilliant river of light that divided the sky and cast a shadow on the flattest nights. This sky was, for the early inhabitants of Mesopotamia, not merely beautiful. It was functional. It was the great clock and calendar of the ancient world, the source of all reliable information about time, about seasons, about the cycles that governed planting and flooding and harvest. To watch the sky with the kind of careful, sustained attention that survival demanded was to develop a relationship with the stars that went very deep, deeper perhaps than modern astronomers, for all their precision instruments experienced today. The early sky watchers of Mesopotamia were not doing science in the modern sense. They were doing something older, and in some ways more intimate. They were listening to the sky the way you listen to someone you have known for a very long time, catching the smallest changes in tone that signal something important is about to be said. It was into this world, according to the stories that the people of ancient Sumer would eventually press into thousands of clay tablets, that the beings they called the Anunnaki first arrived. The stories say they came from somewhere else. The tablets say they came from the sky, or from beneath the earth, or from across the great water, depending on which tradition you follow and which scribal school produced the text you're reading. But before we can understand what the Anunnaki were said to have done, and what they are said to have taken away when they left, we need to sit a little longer in this early world, in the smell of the river and the sound of the reeds and the overwhelming presence of the night sky, and understand just how full and alive and attentive the human world already was before anything else entered it. The dry season in ancient Mesopotamia was a particular kind of hardship. The rivers dropped, the marshes contracted, the ground cracked in long, irregular lines that you could trace with your foot like the writing of some enormous, unhurried hand. The sun pressed down from a sky that had gone white with heat, and the air smelled of dust and dried fish, and the faintly bitter smoke of dung fires. In these months, the people who lived along the river margins drew inward. They conserved water with a discipline that had been learned over generations. They told stories. They sat in the shade of reed walls and passed the long hot hours in a kind of collective dreaming, a weaving together of memory and observation and speculation that was, in its way, the earliest form of what we would later call philosophy. It was in these long, slow seasons of relative stillness that the people of the Mesopotamian plain developed what scholars sometimes call a cosmological imagination, a sustained and serious attempt to understand not just how the world worked in its practical details, but what the world was, where it came from, what it meant, and what place human beings occupied within it. The answers they arrived at were not simple. They were layered and sometimes contradictory, the product of many generations of thinking and revising and preserving in oral tradition what had been thought before. By the time writing emerged, and these ideas began to be recorded on clay tablets, they already carried the weight of an enormous prehistory, a deep well of accumulated wondering. The land itself was central to this cosmological thinking. The Mesopotamian plain, so flat and so fertile and so subject to the unpredictable moods of its rivers, suggested to the people who lived on it a world that was simultaneously generous and dangerous, one that could give life in abundance and take it away with equal indifference. The great floods that periodically swept the plain, drowning villages and fields and animals and people, were not experienced merely as natural disasters. They were experienced as communications, as moments when something vast and largely indifferent made its power felt in ways that no amount of human preparation could fully anticipate or prevent. The floods left behind, as they retreated, both destruction and renewal, the dark gift of new silt, the seeds of the next year's abundance carried on the backs of catastrophe. This paradox, the destructive generosity of the land, shaped the earliest religious thinking of Mesopotamia in ways that would echo for thousands of years. The gods of this world were not uniformly benevolent. They were powerful and purposeful and occasionally merciful, but they were not obligated to be kind. Their relationship with human beings was understood from the very beginning as one of use. The earliest Sumerian myths do not shy away from this. The gods created human beings, the tablets say, to do work, to farm the land, to build the temples, to offer food and oil and song in exchange for the continuation of existence. It was a transaction, clear-eyed and unsentimental, and the people of ancient Sumer accepted it with a kind of stoic practicality that said more about their daily experience of the world than any amount of theological theorizing could. Yet beneath this practical arrangement, something else was also preserved in the earliest layers of Mesopotamian tradition. Something that suggested the relationship between the divine and the human had not always been so clearly transactional. Something that hinted at an earlier time, before the great ordering of civilization, before the cities and the temples and the bureaucracies of religion, when human beings and the forces they would later call gods had moved through the world in a different kind of proximity. When the distance between the earthly and the divine had been smaller, or perhaps had not existed at all in the way it would later come to be understood. It is this hint preserved in the oldest layers of the tablets that our story tonight will follow. The story of what was once present and then was dimmed. The story of 9 capacities that the tradition says were turned down like a lamp, whose oil is being deliberately conserved, not extinguished but reduced, allowed to burn only at the edge of perception, warm enough to remind you of its existence but not bright enough to see by. The story of what was said to have been done, and by whom, and why, and what traces of those original capacities still move through the human world like underground rivers, felt but rarely seen. But that story requires patience. It requires that we lay its foundations slowly and carefully, the way the early builders of Mesopotamia laid their mud brick walls, one course at a time, each layer pressed down and dried before the next was added, building not quickly but surely toward something that would stand. So we will take our time tonight. We will move through this landscape slowly, as the night air cools and your breathing steadies, and the world outside your window settles into its own deep quiet. The earliest archaeological sites in southern Mesopotamia, the ones that sit in the deepest strata of the ancient mounds that scholars call tells, offer a picture of human life that is simultaneously humble and astonishing. The people who lived in these earlier settlements, in the period before writing, before bronze, before the great ziggurats rose above the flat plain, were people of remarkable sophistication in the ways that mattered most for survival. Their pottery was made with a precision and a decorative sensibility that goes well beyond utility. Their tools were shaped with an economy of design that suggests long experience and a kind of unself-conscious mastery. Their dead were buried with care and with objects that indicate a belief in continuation, in some form of existence beyond the visible one, in the persistence of something that outlasted the body. What these people believed about the sky, about the earth, about the forces that moved through both, we can only partially reconstruct from the objects they left behind and from the much later written traditions that preserved, in altered and elaborated form, something of what was believed before writing began. But what we can say with confidence is that they believed the world was alive in a way that went far beyond what we today would call the merely physical, that the rivers had intentions, that the wind carried messages, that the stars were not simply points of light but presences with purposes, moving through their great cycles with a kind of slow deliberateness that a careful observer could learn to read. This was not superstition in the dismissive modern sense of the word. It was a model of the world built from thousands of years of careful observation, tested against experience, refined across generations, and passed down with a seriousness that we might reserve for the most rigorous forms of scientific knowledge. It was, in its own terms, entirely coherent and entirely functional. It allowed people to navigate a complex and often dangerous world with a degree of success that the archaeological record in its patient way confirms. The settlements grew, the populations increased, the fields expanded, the trade routes lengthened. Something was working, and working well, in the way these people understood and moved through their world. It was in this world, growing slowly more complex, slowly more layered, slowly more capable of supporting the kind of surplus production that would eventually give rise to cities and writing and specialized labor, that the Anunnaki first enter the story. Or rather, it was in this world that the people who would eventually write about the Anunnaki first began to feel the presence of something that their descendant scribes would record on clay tablets thousands of years later as the Great Council of the High Ones, the assembly of those who came from the sky to the earth, the beings whose names and ranks and actions would fill library after library of fired clay, and whose influence, the tradition insisted, had shaped everything about what human beings were and were not. The night is quiet now. The reeds at the river's edge have stopped their clicking in the wind. Somewhere across the flat dark plain a dog barks once and then falls silent. The stars overhead are enormous and still, and from somewhere very far away, so far that the distance itself has become a kind of time, something moves toward the edge of the firelight, something patient and purposeful and very, very old. Years passed, then centuries, and the world that waited in the dark between the rivers would never again be quite what it had been before the story began. The smell of the river mud settled into the night air, cool and dark and rich with the promise of another growing season, and the people of the plain lay down in their reed houses and let sleep come over them like a slow tide, unaware that the world they lived in was about to be described, in ways they could not have imagined, by beings whose nature and purposes they were only beginning to sense at the edges of their waking lives. And the lamp oil burned low, and the fire settled, and the flat land stretched away in every direction beneath the turning stars, patient as it had always been, carrying within its dark soil the seeds of everything that was still to come. The oldest tablets that survive from the cities of ancient Sumer are not grand theological proclamations. They are for the most part inventory lists, records of grain distributed to workers, accounts of livestock moving through temple precincts, tallies of oil and barley and cloth. These small practical documents, pressed into soft clay with a reed stylus and left in the sun to harden, represent the first moments when the human voice found a way to persist beyond the lifespan of memory, when thought became object and could be carried from one place to another, from one generation to the next, without the intervening presence of a living person to speak it aloud. But among these practical records, woven into the margins and scattered through the archives of the earlier cities, there are other kinds of tablets that record not quantities of grain, but names. Not merely the names of kings or administrators, but the names of beings who existed, the texts insist, before the cities themselves, before the first furrow was ploughed, before human hands had shaped the first mud brick or woven the first cloth. These are the tablets that speak of the Anunnaki. The word itself appears in the earliest Sumerian text without explanation, as though its meaning were already understood, already part of the inherited knowledge that every person carried simply by virtue of being born into that world. Anunnaki, the great ones who came from heaven to earth, the assembly of the high gods, the council whose decisions shaped not only the fate of human beings, but the structure of the cosmos itself, the arrangement of sky and earth and the waters beneath the earth, the division of time into day and night, the ordering of the seasons, the setting of boundaries that would hold until the world itself grew old and passed away. Later Akkadian scribes, writing in a language that had absorbed and transformed the earlier Sumerian traditions, would sometimes pass the name as meaning those of princely seed, or those who came down from the sky, or the offspring of Anunnaki, sky and earth, the first division that made all other divisions possible. The exact etymology mattered less than the weight the name carried. To speak of the Anunnaki was to speak of the foundation itself, the deep structure upon which everything else rested. They were not distant abstractions. They were active presences, involved in the day-to-day management of the world in ways that modern theological thinking, with its sharp divisions between the sacred and the mundane, finds difficult to map onto any familiar category. The earliest myths that describe the Anunnaki place them in a time, before the calendar began its count, before the first king sat on the first throne and received the emblems of authority from the hands of the gods. In this time before time, the tablets say, the work of the world was done by the gods themselves. The Anunnaki laboured. They dug the channels of the rivers, they cleared the marshes, they established the boundaries of the fields, they carried the clay and shaped the bricks, and raised the first structures from the flat earth. And this labour, the texts make clear, was hard. It was unceasing. It wore on them in ways that even gods apparently could grow weary of. One of the most striking features of these early Sumerian creation myths is their lack of sentimentality about the divine nature. The gods of Mesopotamia were not omnipotent in the later theological sense. They were powerful, yes, enormously powerful, capable of reshaping the landscape and commanding the elements, and living for spans of time that made human lifetimes look like the flicker of an insect's wing. But they were also limited. They had needs, they grew tired. They argued among themselves, they formed factions. They made decisions that were motivated not by abstract justice, but by the same kinds of practical concerns that motivated the human administrators who managed temple estates and palace workshops. The need to get work done, to maintain order, to ensure that the systems they had put in place continued to function. It was this need, according to the oldest versions of the story, that led to the creation of human beings. The Anunnaki had grown tired of their labour. The lesser gods, the Igigi, who served the great Anunnaki and who bore the heaviest burdens of the work, had begun to complain. The texts describe a council, a gathering of the divine assembly at which the problem was discussed and a solution proposed. A new kind of being would be created, a worker, something capable of carrying out the tasks that the gods no longer wished to perform themselves, something made from the clay of the earth, shaped by divine hands, animated by divine breath, but fundamentally separate from the divine realm, bound to the earth in a way the gods were not, mortal where the gods were deathless, limited where the gods were expansive. The details of this creation vary across the different texts that preserve the tradition. In some versions, a goddess shapes the first humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, a rebel deity whose sacrifice provides both the material substance and the animating spark that makes life possible. In other versions, human beings emerge more gradually, shaped over time by divine intention and divine craft, refined through successive attempts until the proper balance is achieved. But across all the variations, certain elements remain constant. Human beings were made to work. They were made to serve, and they were made, the texts insist, with specific limitations built into their design, specific boundaries placed around what they could perceive and do and become. This is the first hint in the written record of what our story tonight is truly about. The suggestion that human beings as they exist now are not human beings as they were first imagined or first made or first intended to be. That something was altered, that certain capacities were present at the beginning and then were withdrawn or reduced or locked away behind doors that most people would never find the keys to. The tablets do not dwell on this point. They mentioned it in passing, almost casually. the way you might mention a detail of construction that any competent builder would understand without needing further explanation. But the detail is there, woven into the oldest layers of the tradition, waiting for those who come later to notice it and wonder what it meant. Imagine for a moment the scribe who first pressed these words into wet clay. He sits in a small room in a temple complex in the city of Uruk or Nippur or Eridu, one of the great centres of early Sumerian civilization. The walls around him are mud brick, thick and cool even in the heat of midday. Light comes through a single high window, a shaft of brightness cutting through the dimness, illuminating the dust that hangs in the still air. Before him, on a low table, sits a lump of clean river clay, prepared that morning by an apprentice who kneaded it until it reached the proper consistency, smooth and yielding but firm enough to hold the mark of the reed stylus without collapsing. The scribe has been trained since childhood in the complex art of cuneiform writing, the wedge-shaped marks that represent not pictures but sounds, syllables, abstract units of meaning that can be combined and recombined to capture anything the human voice can speak. He learned by copying the same standard texts over and over, lists of words, proverbs, excerpts from the great myths, and king lists and hymns that form the core curriculum of the scribal schools. His hand knows the movements without conscious thought now. The angle of the stylus, the depth of the impression, the spacing that keeps one sign distinct from the next. He writes the way a potter throws a pot, with a physical knowledge that lives in muscle and bone. What he is writing today is not a new composition. It is a copy of an older tablet, one that has been copied many times before, each generation of scribes preserving the tradition by reproducing it, adding their own small variations and corrections and occasionally their own marginal notes, but keeping the core intact. The myth he copies today tells the story of the creation of human beings, the assembly of the gods, the decision to make workers from clay. He has copied this text before, he will copy it again. And as his stylus moves across the soft surface of the clay, pressing down the signs that spell out the names of the great Anunnaki and the words they spoke in council and the actions they took to bring human beings into existence, he is participating in something larger than himself, an act of preservation and transmission that links him backward to the first scribe who composed this text and forward to all the scribes who will come after him, all the way down to the archaeologists and translators of the modern world, who will one day lift his tablet from the earth and read his work across a gap of more than 4,000 years. The text he copies describes the Anunnaki with a specificity that suggests real knowledge, or at least the strong memory of real knowledge passed down through many generations. The tablets give them names, and the sky god, the distant father, the source of ultimate authority, Enlil, Lord of the Wind, master of the Tablet of Destinies, the executive power who carries out the will of the assembly, Enki, Lord of the waters beneath the earth, the craftsman god, the clever one whose knowledge of the deep patterns of existence makes him the natural choice to oversee the shaping of the new creation, Nin-Hersag, the mother goddess, mistress of birth and form, whose hands do the actual work of moulding the clay and breathing life into it, and many others, 50 great gods and 7 gods who decree fates, arranged in hierarchies and assigned to specific cosmic functions, managing between them the operations of earth and sky and the space between. These were not metaphors to the people of ancient Sumer. The evidence from the tablets makes that clear. The gods were understood as real entities with real agency, as actual as the king in his palace or the merchant in the marketplace, but operating on a different scale and with a different kind of power. They lived in the temples, or rather, the temples were understood as their literal houses, the places where they resided when they chose to be present in the human world. The cult statues that stood in the innermost chambers of these temples were not representations of the gods. They were, in a sense that is difficult for the modern secular mind to fully grasp, the gods themselves, or at least the bodies the gods inhabited when they wished to interact with human worshippers. The statues were fed, they were clothed, they were bathed and anointed with oil, they were sung to, they were consulted, and the priest who performed these services understood themselves to be doing exactly what the first human beings had been created to do, maintaining the house of the god, providing for the god's needs, ensuring the continuation of the relationship that kept the world in order. But the Anunnaki, the texts make clear, were not always present in their temples. They had other concerns, other realms. The myths speak often of journeys the gods took, descents into the underworld, ascents into the high heavens, travels to the edges of the world where the sky met the cosmic ocean, and the sun passed each night on its journey beneath the earth. The Anunnaki were mobile, they moved between worlds, and this mobility, this capacity to exist in multiple realms and to pass between them, was one of the things that set them apart from human beings, who were bound to the earth, tied to their bodies, and to the places their bodies could walk or sail or ride, limited by the shortness of their lives and the narrowness of their perception. This contrast between the expansive awareness of the divine and the contracted awareness of the human runs through the Mesopotamian texts like a deep current. The gods saw everything. They knew what was hidden. They perceived the past and the future as easily as a human being perceived the present. They could hear a whisper spoken 100 miles away. They could feel the intention forming in a human heart before it became conscious thought. They moved through a world that was utterly transparent to them, while human beings moved through a world that was mostly opaque, reading only the surfaces of things, guessing at what lay beneath, stumbling forward through time with only the dimmest sense of what was coming, and almost no reliable memory of what had truly happened in the generations before their own. Yet the tablets also preserve another tradition, one that sits a little uneasily beside the standard creation accounts, but that recurs often enough to suggest it carried real weight in the culture's understanding of its own past. This is the tradition that human beings in the earliest generations had been different, that the first people, the ones shaped most directly by the hands of the gods, had possessed capacities that their descendants no longer had, or had only in drastically reduced form. That something had been lost, or taken away, or locked down in a way that made it inaccessible to all but a very few specially trained individuals. The clearest expression of this tradition comes not from a single text, but from a pattern that emerges when you read many texts together, letting them speak to one another across the centuries. The pattern is this. The earliest generations of human beings, the ones who lived immediately after the creation, are described as having direct contact with the gods. They spoke with them. They saw them. They received knowledge from them without the need for intermediaries, without priests or rituals or elaborate temple procedures. The relationship was, in those earliest times, immediate and personal. A human being could encounter a god the way you might encounter a neighbour, with the appropriate awe and deference, certainly, but without the layers of mediation that would later become necessary. Then something changed. The texts are not entirely clear about when or why, but the change is marked and consistent across the tradition. The gods withdrew, or the human capacity to perceive them directly diminished, or both happened at once in a process that the myths describe sometimes as a conscious decision and sometimes as a gradual drift, the way a conversation grows quieter as the speakers move farther apart until finally only silence remains. The Great Flood tradition, which appears in Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Hebrew sources, sits at this hinge point in the story. Before the flood, the texts suggest the world was one way. After the flood, it was another. What exactly changed is described in different ways depending on the tradition you follow, but the fact of a change, a break, a moment when the old world ended and a new world began under different conditions, is preserved across all the versions. Something was decided, something was altered, and human beings in the new world, the world after the water receded, found themselves operating under a different set of rules, with different capacities, different limits, different kinds of knowledge available to them and different kinds forever closed. Outside the scribe's window, the afternoon light is beginning to soften toward evening. The heat that pressed down all day is easing. In the streets of the city, people are finishing their work, washing their hands and faces in the communal fountains, walking home to their small houses where bread is being baked and children are being called in from their games. The scribe sets down his stylus and flexes his fingers. The tablet before him is covered with neat lines of cuneiform, a small piece of the great puzzle of stories and genealogies and cosmological explanations that together form the intellectual foundation of his civilization. He does not think of his work as mythology. He thinks of it as history, as the record of what actually happened, preserved by those who were there or who heard from those who were there, passed down carefully through the generations, and now entrusted to him to copy and preserve for whoever comes next. The Anunnaki are as real to him as the kings whose year names he also copies, as real as the temple administrators whose inventories fill most of the archive where he works. They are simply operating on a different scale, in a different realm, according to different laws. But they are real. They were here. And what they did shaped everything about what the world is now. The scribe stands and carries his tablet carefully to the drying rack, where dozens of other tablets sit waiting for the sun to finish hardening them. Tomorrow or the next day, when the clay has cured completely, the tablet will be filed in the archive, placed on a wooden shelf alongside thousands of others, a library of human knowledge growing slowly larger, one tablet at a time, one careful copy at a time, building toward a critical mass that will allow future generations to look back and see where they came from, and understand, if they read carefully enough, what was given to them and what was held back. The sun is touching the horizon now. The light coming through the window has turned gold and then amber and is now fading toward the deep blue of twilight. The scribe walks out into the temple courtyard where a fountain plays softly, fed by a channel that connects to the city's larger irrigation system. He washes his hands in the cool water, feeling the clay residue dissolve and drift away. Around him, the sounds of the city settle into their evening rhythms. Lamps are being lit. Doors are closing. The stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky, faint at first and then brighter. The same stars that shone on the first cities, on the first people, on the world before the cities when the Anunnaki walked the earth and human beings had not yet learned to be what they would become. What did those first people know that we have forgotten? What could they do that we can no longer imagine? What was the world like when the doors of perception stood fully open, before someone, for reasons that made sense in the logic of gods if not in the logic of human longing, decided it was time to close them, or at least to pull them nearly shut, leaving only the thinnest crack of light to remind us of what lies on the other side? These are the questions that the tablets do not answer directly, but that they nevertheless pose, quietly, persistently, to anyone who reads them with patience and attention. And tonight, as the world outside your window grows dark and quiet, we will walk through those questions together, slowly and carefully, feeling our way toward an understanding that the ancient scribes preserved in fragments and hints, in the spaces between one story and the next, in the silences that surround the words they chose to write down. The night is settling now over the ancient plain. The rivers are moving in their channels with the same slow power they have always moved with. The reeds are still, and somewhere in the deepening darkness, the memory of the Anunnaki waits like a seed in the earth, patient and viable, ready to grow again in any mind that gives it the right kind of attention. The creation stories preserved in the tablets of ancient Mesopotamia are not single, unified narratives. They are multiple, overlapping, sometimes contradictory accounts that seem to approach the same central mystery from different angles, each one illuminating a different facet of how human beings came to be and what their relationship with the divine was meant to look like. To read these stories today, separated from them by thousands of years and by the vast distance between our way of thinking and the way the ancient Sumerians thought, is to engage in a kind of archaeological listening, piecing together not just what the words say but what they assume, what they take for granted, what they do not bother to explain because everyone in their original audience already understood it. One of the most detailed accounts comes from a tablet known to modern scholars as the Atrahasis epic, named after its human protagonist, a figure whose name means exceedingly wise and who plays a role in the Mesopotamian flood tradition, similar to the role Noah plays in the Hebrew Bible. But before the flood narrative begins, the Atrahasis epic spends considerable time describing the world as it was before human beings existed, and the process by which the gods decided to create them. The tablet describes a division of labour among the divine beings. The great Anunnaki, the senior gods, had divided the cosmos among themselves and took the heavens. Enlil took the earth, Enki took the waters. This division was not arbitrary. It reflected a cosmic order, a structure that would remain stable as long as each god kept to his assigned realm and fulfilled his assigned function. But the earth required work. Fields needed to be dug. Canals needed to be cut. The rivers needed to be managed, their floods controlled, their waters directed to where they would do the most good. This work fell to the Igigi, the lesser gods, the divine labourers who served the great Anunnaki. For a long time, the tablet says, the Igigi did this work without complaint. The text measures the time in years that seem impossibly long by human standards, numbers that signal not precise chronology but deep time, mythic time, the the kind of time that exists before history begins its count. But eventually, the Igigi grew weary. The work was hard. It never ended. And they began to ask why they should continue to bear this burden when they were, after all, divine beings themselves, not fundamentally different in nature from the great Anunnaki they served, only different in rank. The complaint came to a head one night. The Igigi put down their tools, they gathered together. They took the tools they had been using to dig the earth and they burned them, and then they marched to the house of Enlil, the great god whose authority over the earth made him their direct overseer. The tablet describes their approach in terms that would have resonated deeply with anyone in ancient Mesopotamia who had ever been part of a labour dispute or witnessed the tension that arose when workers felt they had been pushed beyond what was bearable. The Igigi did not come as supplicants. They came as a force, united and determined, demanding to be heard. Enlil's initial response was anger. The text describes him arming himself, preparing to meet force with force, but other gods intervened. Ea, who is another name for Enki, the wise god of the deep waters, counselled a different approach. The problem, Ea pointed out, was real. The work was indeed hard. The Igigi's complaint was not unreasonable, but the work also needed to be done. The solution, therefore, was not to suppress the complaint, but to find a different way to get the work done. A new kind of worker was needed, one who could do the physical labour that the gods found burdensome, but who would not have the status or the power to rebel in the way the Igigi had rebelled. This is where the creation of human beings enters the story. Ea proposed it. The assembly of the Anunnaki debated it, and eventually they agreed. A new creature would be made. The tablet describes the process in terms that are both technical and magical, a mixture of craft and ritual that suggests the gods understood creation as something that required both skill and power, both knowledge and divine force. The mother goddess Belet Ili, who is also called Mami or Nintu or Ninhursag depending on which text you read, was charged with the actual work of shaping the new beings, but she required raw materials. The text specifies that clay would form the body, the same river clay that human potters used and that brickmakers mixed with straw to build the walls of houses and temples. But clay alone was not enough. Something else was needed to animate it, to give it not just form but life, not just shape but consciousness. The solution the gods arrived at was striking in its bluntness. One of the gods would have to be killed. His blood would be mixed with the clay. His flesh would be incorporated into the mixture, and his essence, whatever divine spark had made him a living conscious being, would be transferred into the new creation, giving human beings a kind of life that was partly earthly, deriving from the clay and partly divine, deriving from the sacrificed god. The text names the god who was chosen for this sacrifice. Wi'ilu, it calls him, or in some versions simply Geshtui, a deity whose name appears nowhere else in the Mesopotamian pantheon and who seems to exist in the tradition solely for this purpose, to be the one who dies so that humanity can live. Whether this represents an actual theological belief or whether it is a narrative device, a way of explaining the paradox that human beings seem to be both earthly and something more than earthly, bound to matter but capable of thought and self-awareness, and the kind of reaching toward the infinite that characterizes religious experience, is a question the text does not answer because it does not ask it. The story simply proceeds. The god is killed, his blood is collected, the clay is mixed, and from this mixture, the first human beings are formed. Belet Ili shapes them carefully. The text describes her working with the focused attention of a skilled craftsperson, someone who knows exactly what she's trying to achieve and how to bring it about. She pinches off pieces of the clay mixture and forms them into small figures, 7 male and 7 female, the first generation from which all subsequent humanity will descend. She speaks words over them, incantations or blessings, or simply the naming that brings something from potential into actuality. And then, the tablet says, she breathes into them, and they live. The first breath of the first human being is described in the text with a simplicity that carries enormous weight. It is not explained, it is not theorized, it simply happens. One moment there are clay figures on the ground, the next moment there are living beings, breathing, blinking, looking around at the world they have just entered, seeing for the first time the faces of the gods who made them, feeling for the first time the ground beneath their feet and the air moving in and out of their lungs, and the strange, overwhelming fact of being alive and aware and present in a world they did not ask to enter, but that they now inhabit fully and irrevocably. What did those first human beings perceive? The tablets are quiet on this point, but other texts, other traditions preserved in the wider literature of ancient Mesopotamia, suggest that the earliest humans were not quite like their descendants. They were closer to their makers. The divine blood that animated them was still fresh, still potent, not yet diluted by generations of purely human reproduction. They could, some texts hint, perceive things that later humans would not be able to perceive. They could hear voices in the wind. They could see presences in the fire. They could sense the moods of the gods the way you might sense the mood of someone standing close to you, not by reasoning about it, but by direct apprehension, by a kind of knowing that bypassed language and logic and operated at a level that was more fundamental than thought. This heightened perception, this openness to the presence of the divine, was not presented in the texts as something supernatural. It was simply the natural condition of beings who had been made from divine material and who had not yet learned to filter out most of what their senses offered them. They lived, these first people, in a world that was saturated with meaning, where everything spoke and everything mattered, and the boundary between the physical and the metaphysical was so thin as to be almost non-existent. But the gods had not created human beings to be their equals. They had created them to be workers, and so from the very beginning, even as the first humans drew their first breaths, limits were being discussed. The Anunnaki knew that if human beings were too much like gods, they would be dangerous. They would want what gods wanted. They would reach for what gods had. The balance had to be carefully maintained. Human beings needed to be capable enough to do the work required of them, intelligent enough to learn and remember and pass knowledge on to their children, strong enough to endure the hardships of earthly life. But they could not be so capable, so intelligent, so strong that they threatened the divine order itself. The texts preserve different accounts of how these limits were established. In some versions, the limits were built into the very act of creation, woven into the clay and blood mixture before the first breath was breathed. In other versions, the limits came later, imposed after the gods had observed the first generations of humans and decided that certain adjustments were necessary. The timing varies, but the fact of limitation, of deliberate constraint, of capacities that were reduced or sealed or hidden away where human beings could not easily access them, is consistent across the tradition. In the early generations, according to the king lists and genealogies preserved on clay tablets from multiple cities, human beings lived for enormous spans of time. The antediluvian kings, the rulers who reigned before the Great Flood, are credited with reigns that last thousands of years, sometimes tens of thousands. Modern scholars generally read these numbers as symbolic or as the result of a different method of counting years than the one we use. But another reading is possible, one that the texts themselves seem to suggest. Perhaps the first humans, being closer to their divine origins, simply lasted longer. Perhaps their bodies, animated by the fresh blood of a god, did not break down the way later bodies would break down. Perhaps aging itself, the slow deterioration that all human beings now experience, was not part of the original design but was added later. Another limit, another way of ensuring that human beings would remain fundamentally different from the gods who made them. Imagine one of these early people, a man or woman living in the generations immediately after creation. They wake in the morning in a house built of reeds plastered with the mud. Simple but well made, standing on a slight rise above the floodplain where the first experimental fields of barley are beginning to take root. The air is cool, the sun has not yet risen, but the sky to the east is beginning to pale. They step outside and the world greets them not as a collection of separate objects but as a living whole, every part of it connected to every other part in ways they can feel without needing to articulate. They walk to the edge of the settlement where the work will begin today. A new canal needs to be dug, an extension of the irrigation system that will bring water to fields that are still wild, still covered with the grasses and low shrubs that grow naturally on the plain. The work is hard. It requires tools, wooden spades with fire-hardened points, baskets woven from reeds to carry the excavated earth. It requires coordination, many people working together, following a plan that someone has thought through and explained and that everyone has agreed to follow. But as this person works, as they bend and lift and carry and dig, they are not separate from the landscape around them. They feel the moisture in the soil before they break through to it with their spade. They know where the water wants to flow, can sense the slight grade of the land that will determine whether the canal will work or whether it will need to be adjusted. They hear the birds overhead not as background noise but as information, as signals about the weather that is coming, about the movements of animals in the marshes, about the health of the ecosystem that sustains them. The knowledge they carry is not abstract. It is intimate. It lives in their body and in their senses and in a quality of awareness that does not separate the knower from the known. At midday, they rest in the shade of a reed shelter. Someone has brought bread and beer, the staples of the Mesopotamian diet, made from the same barley that grows in the fields and that will grow more abundantly if the canal they are digging functions as intended. They eat slowly, talking quietly with their companions, sharing observations about the work, about the land, about the dreams someone had the night before that might carry a message from one of the gods. The conversation drifts. Someone begins to sing, a simple melody without words, just a line of sound that rises and falls and that the others join, their voices blending until the song becomes a single thing, a woven texture of sound that feels, for the moments it lasts, like a door opening onto something vast and wordless and shared. This is what life felt like in those early generations, if the text can be trusted. Not a life of ease, certainly. The work was real and hard, but a life of presence, of connection, of direct unmediated contact with the world and with each other, and with the divine presences that move through the world like currents in deep water, invisible but palpable to anyone who had learned to feel for them. The Anunnaki, in these early times, were teachers. The texts are clear about this. They gave human beings the arts of civilization. Not all at once, but gradually, as each art was needed, and as human beings demonstrated the capacity to receive it and use it well. The god Enki, lord of wisdom and craft, was particularly active in this role. The myths credit him with teaching the first farmers how to plough, how to harness oxen, how to choose seed and prepare the soil and time the planting to the rhythms of the flood and the seasons. He taught the first brewers how to make beer from barley, how to control the fermentation, how to achieve the right balance of sweetness and strength. He taught the first builders how to make bricks, how to lay them in courses, how to build walls that would stand and roofs that would not collapse under their own weight. Other gods taught other arts. Nidaba, goddess of writing and accounting, taught the first scribes. Ninkasi taught brewing in some traditions, while in others she was the embodiment of beer itself, the divine presence in the drink that brought joy and loosened the tongue and allowed people to speak more freely than they otherwise might. Nisaba taught grain management. Dumuzi taught shepherding. Each god had a domain, an area of expertise, and each god shared that expertise with human beings according to a plan that unfolded across generations. But this teaching, this generous sharing of divine knowledge, came with conditions. The gods were not giving human beings everything they knew. They were giving them what they needed to do the work they had been created to do. The knowledge was practical, useful, oriented toward production and maintenance, and the continuation of the system that the gods had established. It was not, or not primarily, knowledge oriented toward freedom, toward transcendence, toward the kind of understanding that would allow human beings to step outside the role that had been assigned to them. And there were other things, deeper things, that the gods kept to themselves. The texts hint at this in various ways. They speak of secret knowledge, of mysteries that only the gods understood, of powers that human beings were not permitted to access. Some of this secret knowledge concerned the structure of the cosmos itself, the mechanisms by which the world operated, the names and words and formulas that could, if spoken with the right intention and the right authority, compel reality to bend and shift and reconfigure itself according to the will of the speaker. Other secret knowledge concerned time. The gods knew the future. They held the tablets of destiny on which all fates were written. They could see the pattern of what was coming, not as possibility, but as certainty, the way you can see the pattern in a woven cloth once enough of it has been completed. Human beings, by contrast, lived inside time, moving through it one moment after another, unable to see ahead, forced to navigate by memory and by guesswork and by the small hints and omens that the gods occasionally permitted to leak through the barrier between divine foreknowledge and human ignorance. There was knowledge, too, about the body, about what it was capable of, about the connections between breath and awareness, between sound and state of consciousness, between intention and physical form. The gods, being able to take different forms, being able to move between realms, clearly understood something about the nature of embodiment that went far beyond what was common knowledge among human beings. And this understanding, this deep somatic wisdom, was largely withheld. Human beings were given bodies that worked well enough for the tasks they needed to perform, but the full potential of those bodies, the capacities that lay dormant in the clay and blood mixture from which they had been formed, remained locked, accessible only through disciplines and practices that very few humans would ever discover. The evening comes slowly to the Mesopotamian plain. The heat of the day fades gradually, the temperature dropping degree by degree until finally the air is cool enough to breathe comfortably. The workers have finished their day's labour on the canal. They return to their houses, to the smell of bread baking in clay ovens, to the sound of children playing in the narrow lanes between houses, to the familiar rhythms of domestic life that repeat day after day with small variations but fundamentally the same pattern. The same needs met, the same comforts sought, the same gratitude offered to the gods who make it all possible. A woman tends a small lamp, a clay saucer filled with oil in which a wick of twisted fibre burns with a steady yellow flame. The light it gives is modest, enough to see by in the gathering darkness, but not enough to push the darkness very far back. She moves around her house, completing the small tasks that end the day. She sweeps the floor. She checks that the door is securely fastened. She speaks quietly to her children, telling them it is time to sleep. And then she sits for a moment in the doorway, looking out at the darkening sky, watching the first stars appear. She knows the names of some of those stars, not the names modern astronomers use, but the names her people have always used, names that connect the lights in the sky to stories about the gods, to the cycles of planting and harvest, to the great cosmic order that holds everything in place. She does not know, because no one has told her, that the stars are distant suns, that the universe is incomprehensibly vast, that the light she is seeing left its source years or centuries or millennia before she was born. But she knows other things. She knows that the stars are reliable, that they move through their patterns with a steadiness that the earth beneath her feet, for all its solidity, does not match. She knows that to watch the stars is to touch something eternal, something that was there before she was born and will be there after she dies, something that connects her to every person who has ever looked up at the night sky and felt what she feels now, a mixture of smallness and wonder and strange belonging. The gods are up there somewhere, she believes, or they are down here, walking in forms she cannot quite perceive, attending to the maintenance of the world with the same careful attention she brings to the maintenance of her household. They are present, they are real, and the fact that she cannot always see them or hear them does not make them less real. It only means that her eyes and ears are not made to perceive everything, that there are limits to what she can know directly, and that these limits are part of the design, part of what makes her human rather than divine. She does not question this. It would not occur to her to question it. The order of things is the order of things. The gods made the world. They made human beings. They gave what they chose to give, and held back what they chose to hold back. And her task, like the task of every human being, is not to reach for what has been denied, but to make the best use of what has been granted, to live well within the limits, to work hard, to raise her children, to honour the gods in the small daily ways that honour can be shown, to trust that the system holds, that the forces managing it are wiser than she is, that the design is good even when she cannot see the whole of it. The stars burn steadily in their appointed places. The night deepens, and somewhere far away in realms she can barely imagine, the Anunnaki deliberate over the fate of the world they have made, weighing what must be preserved and what must be changed, what must be given and what must, for reasons that make sense in the long view of cosmic order, be taken away. The turning point, when it came, is described in the text not as a single dramatic moment, but as a process that unfolded over generations. The human population grew, the first settlements expanded, the fields spread farther from the rivers. Children were born and grew and had children of their own, and the earth, which had seemed so empty when the first humans opened their eyes, began to fill with the sounds and activity of human life. This growth was, in one sense, exactly what the gods had intended. They had made human beings to multiply, to spread across the land to do the work that needed doing. The success of the creation should have been cause for satisfaction, but the texts suggest that the gods had not fully anticipated what success would look like, Or perhaps they had not thought through all of its implications. The Atrahasis epic is explicit about what became problematic. It was the noise, the tumult of human life, the constant activity, the voices, the sounds of work and play and argument and celebration that rose from the growing settlements and disturbed the peace of the gods. The tablet describes it in terms that sound almost domestic in their specificity. The gods could not sleep. The racket that human beings made as they went about their lives was too much, too loud, too unceasing. Enlil, in particular, is portrayed as increasingly disturbed by the human presence. The texts describe him lying awake, unable to rest, irritated beyond endurance by the noise rising from the earth below. And in his irritation, he began to consider solutions. Perhaps, he suggested to the divine assembly, human beings had been allowed to multiply too freely. Perhaps their numbers needed to be reduced. Perhaps the creation, successful in its way, had been too successful and now required adjustment. The first attempts to reduce the human population are described in the Atrahasis epic as measured and specific. Enlil sent plague. A disease swept through the human settlements, killing many, reducing the noise to a level that was more tolerable. For a time, the problem seemed solved, but human beings recovered. They buried their dead, mourned them, and then continued living. They had children to replace those who had been lost. Within a generation, the population had recovered and the noise had returned to its previous level. Enlil tried again. This time he sent drought. The rains failed. The rivers dropped. The crops withered in the fields. Famine spread through the settlements, and again many died. The texts describe the suffering this caused in terms that are unflinching. Mothers unable to feed their children. The elderly dying quietly in corners. The social fabric beginning to tear as desperation drove people to acts they would not have considered in times of abundance. But again, enough survived, and when the rains finally returned, when the rivers rose again and the fields greened and the famine ended, the human population began once more to grow. It was at this point, according to the tradition, that Enlil proposed a more permanent solution. He would send a flood. Not a seasonal overflow, not the kind of flood that deposited silt and then retreated, but a catastrophic inundation that would erase human civilization entirely, that would wash the earth clean and return it to the silence it had known before the first human voice was raised in song or complaint or prayer. The assembly of the Anunnaki debated this proposal. Some gods supported it, others had reservations, but Enlil's authority carried the day, and the decision was made. The flood would come. What happened next is one of the most famous sequences in Mesopotamian literature. Enki, the wise god who had originally proposed the creation of human beings and who had overseen the process of their making, chose to intervene. He could not openly defy the decision of the assembly. The gods had sworn an oath to keep the plan secret from humanity, and oaths among the gods were binding in ways that went beyond mere words. But Enki found a way around the prohibition. He did not speak directly to a human being. Instead, he spoke to a wall. He went to the reed house of Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise man, and he stood outside and spoke to the wall, describing in detail the flood that was coming and explaining how a boat might be built that could survive it. Atrahasis, listening from inside his house, heard everything. He understood what was being communicated and why it was being communicated in this indirect way, and he set to work immediately, building the boat according to the specifications that Enki had described. The text gives measurements, materials, instructions for waterproofing the hull with bitumen, guidance about what to bring aboard. Atrahasis worked quickly and carefully, and when the boat was finished, he loaded it with his family, with craftspeople whose skills would be needed to rebuild civilization after the waters receded, with animals representing the major domesticated species, and with seed grain from the fields. Then the flood came. The texts describe it in language that evokes overwhelming force, elemental rage, the breakdown of the normal boundaries between earth and sky and sea. The dikes that held back the cosmic waters were opened. The fountains of the deep burst forth. Rain fell in torrents that turned day into night. The rivers overflowed their banks and kept rising, covering the fields, the settlements, the temples, everything that human beings had built. The world that had been became a world of water, featureless and grey, stretching to every horizon without interruption. For 7 days and 7 nights the flood continued. The boat rode the waters, sealed and dark inside, its passengers unable to see what was happening beyond the pitch-covered hull. able only to feel the rising and falling, the tilting and righting, the terrible motion that confirmed they were adrift on something vaster than anything they had imagined. And then gradually the waters began to recede. The rain stopped. The boat came to rest on a mountain. Atrahasis opened a window and released birds to test whether the earth had reappeared. First a dove, which found no place to land and returned. Then a swallow, which also returned. Finally a raven, which did not return, signalling that somewhere beyond the horizon there was dry land again, a place where life could take root. When Atrahasis finally emerged from the boat and set foot on the muddy slope of the mountain, the first thing he did was build an altar and offer sacrifice to the gods. The smoke of the offering rose into the clear sky, and the gods, who had been without human service during the flood, without the food and incense and attention that they had grown accustomed to receiving, gathered around the sacrifice like flies, the text says. They were hungry. They had missed the worship. And in that moment of gathering around the offering, the dynamic between gods and humans became clear in a new way. The gods needed human beings almost as much as human beings needed the gods. The relationship was not one-directional. It was reciprocal, mutually sustaining, a system that worked only when both parties participated. Enlil, when he saw that humans had survived, was initially furious. His plan had been thwarted. The noise would return. But the other gods spoke to him. They pointed out what the flood had revealed, that human beings were necessary, that the world worked better with them than without them. But they also acknowledged that Enlil's complaint had been legitimate. Human beings in their unrestrained form, multiplying without limit, filling the earth with their activity, were too much. A balance needed to be struck. This is where the tradition becomes most interesting for our purposes tonight, because what follows in the texts is not simply a decision to limit human population, but a broader discussion about human capacity itself. The gods had made human beings from divine material. They had given them consciousness, intelligence, the ability to learn and remember and plan. But perhaps, some of the gods suggested, they had given too much. Perhaps human beings, if left to develop without constraint, would eventually become rivals rather than servants. Perhaps it was necessary to ensure that certain abilities remained locked away, that certain kinds of knowledge stayed beyond human reach, that the gap between divine and human, which had been uncomfortably narrow in the earliest generations, be widened and made permanent. Different texts preserve different versions of what was decided in this council after the flood, but a pattern emerges when you read across the tradition. Human lifespan would be limited. No more kings reigning for thousands of years, no more individuals living long enough to accumulate wisdom across centuries. Mortality would become more pressing, more immediate, more defining of the human condition. Human beings would have perhaps 100 years if they were fortunate, perhaps less, and in that short span they would have to learn everything they needed to know and do everything they hoped to accomplish and then make way for the next generation. Human perception would also be constrained. The easy commerce with the divine that had characterized the earliest generations would fade. The gods would withdraw, or the human ability to perceive them directly would diminish, or both would happen together, creating a new situation in which the divine realm and the human realm, though still connected, were no longer continuous. Human beings would have to work harder to make contact with the gods, would have to rely on intermediaries, on priests and rituals and carefully prescribed procedures, rather than on the direct apprehension that had once been common. Human memory would be affected as well. The perfect recall that some traditions attribute to the earliest humans, the ability to remember everything they had seen and heard and learned across a lifetime, would be replaced by something more fallible, more selective, more prone to distortion and loss. Knowledge would have to be written down if it was to be preserved, entrusted to clay tablets and to the scribal schools that trained each generation of record keepers. And even then, much would be lost. The great libraries would burn. Tablets would be broken or buried or simply misplaced. The continuity of knowledge that had once been maintained through living memory would become fragmented, uncertain, dependent on the survival of fragile physical objects. There were other capacities too, according to traditions preserved in later esoteric texts and in the practices of temple priesthoods, who claimed to maintain knowledge that went back to the earliest times. The ability to perceive the subtle energies that moved through the body and through the landscape. The ability to influence those energies through breath and sound and focused intention. The ability to move consciousness beyond the boundaries of the physical body, to travel in dreams or visions to other realms and return with knowledge that could not be gained through ordinary means. The ability to communicate mind to mind without words, to know what another person was thinking or feeling through direct apprehension, rather than through interpreting external signs. The ability to sense the future, not with perfect clarity but with enough accuracy to prepare, to adjust course, to avoid dangers that had not yet manifested. These abilities, the tradition suggests, were not given to all human beings equally even in the beginning. Some people had them more strongly than others, but they were present in the general population to a degree that would seem remarkable by later standards, and it was these abilities, more than anything else, that the Anunnaki decided must be reduced if human beings were to remain safely within the role that had been designed for them. How this reduction was accomplished is not described in mechanical detail in the texts that survive. The gods did not, apparently, perform surgery on human bodies or rewire human brains. What they did, according to the fragmentary hints scattered through various tablets, was more subtle. They adjusted something fundamental about how human consciousness interfaced with the physical body. They changed the settings, you might say, dimmed the reception, narrowed the bandwidth through which information flowed from the larger reality into human awareness. Some traditions speak of seals or locks, barriers placed in the energy structure of the human body that prevented certain kinds of perception and certain kinds of power from manifesting. Other traditions speak of forgetting, a veil drawn across memory so that human beings no longer remembered what they had once been capable of, no longer even knew that there was anything to miss. Still, other traditions speak of a change in the air itself, in the quality of light or sound or some more subtle medium through which consciousness operated, a change that made certain frequencies inaccessible to human senses that had once been able to detect them. Whatever the mechanism, the effect was clear. After the flood, after the new covenant between gods and humans was established, human beings were different. They lived shorter lives. They knew less. They saw less. They could do less. The early chapters of human history, the time before the flood when the world had been young and the gods had walked openly among their creation, passed into memory, and then into legend, and then into the kind of story that people told but did not quite believe, a story about a golden age that had never really existed except in the wishful imagination of people whose own lives felt too hard and too limited and too brief. But the memory persisted nonetheless, preserved in the temple archives, in the training of priests and priestesses who claimed descent from the antediluvian wise ones, in the practices of certain scribal families who maintained disciplines and techniques that were said to restore, or at least partially restore, some of the capacities that had been lost. These were not common practices. They required years of training, a kind of dedication that few people could sustain, and even then the results were uncertain. But the fact that such practices existed, that they were taken seriously by people whose intelligence and education commanded respect, suggests that the tradition of lost capacities was not merely fanciful. It pointed to something real, something that had been experienced often enough and reliably enough to be worth preserving and pursuing, even when the larger culture had mostly forgotten what it was pursuing. A priest in the temple of Enki in the city of Eridu, living perhaps 1,000 years after the flood traditions say the great inundation occurred, spends his mornings in a small chamber deep within the temple complex. The chamber is cool and dark, its walls covered with inscriptions that only those initiated into the mysteries of the temple are taught to read. He sits on a low stool, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, and he breathes in a pattern that was taught to him by his teacher, who learned it from his teacher, who learned it from his, going back in an unbroken line to the time before the flood when such knowledge was common. As he breathes, something shifts. The quality of his awareness changes. The normal chattering stream of thoughts that fills most of his waking hours grows quiet. He becomes aware of his body in a new way, feeling the subtle currents of energy that move through it, the channels and centers that the sacred texts describe but that most people never perceive directly. He can feel where the energy flows freely and where it is blocked or sluggish. He can, with practice and patience, direct the flow, opening channels that have been closed, bringing light and warmth to parts of himself that normally operate in darkness. This is not magic in the sense of violating natural law. It is, from his perspective, simply a deeper engagement with natural law, a way of working with forces that are always present, but that most people do not know how to perceive or influence. The training is difficult. It requires discipline and renunciation, a willingness to set aside the ordinary pleasures and ambitions that drive most human lives. But for those who persist, the texts promise results: enhanced vitality, clarity of mind, the ability to perceive things that are hidden from ordinary sight, the ability to influence events through focused intention, the ability to communicate under the right conditions with the divine presences that still move through the world even though they are no longer visible to common perception. Whether this priest achieves what the texts promise is a question we cannot answer with certainty across the distance of millennia. But that he and many others like him devoted their lives to the attempt tells us something important about the culture they inhabited. They believed that human beings had capacities beyond the ones they exercised in daily life. They believed that these capacities could be recovered through discipline and training, and they believed that doing so brought them closer to what human beings had been in the beginning, before the limitations were imposed, before the seals were set, before the great forgetting settled over the world like dust after a sandstorm. Outside the temple, the city goes about its business. Merchants haggle in the marketplace, potters shape clay on their wheels, fishermen mend nets by the waterside, children play in the narrow streets, their voices bright and sharp in the afternoon air. The rhythms of ordinary life continue as they have always continued, largely unaware of the disciplines being practiced in the temple's inner chambers, largely unconcerned with questions about lost capacities and ancient knowledge. For most people, life is full enough as it is. There is work to do, bread to earn, children to raise, small pleasures to enjoy when time and circumstance allow. But the knowledge is preserved nonetheless, held in trust by those whose calling it is to remember, waiting for the times and the people who might need it, who might be ready to take up the work of recovery, of remembering what was forgotten, of opening what was sealed, of seeing again with eyes that the Anunnaki, in their wisdom or their caution or their need to maintain order, had decided must remain mostly closed. The sun is setting now over the ancient city. The light turns golden and then red, and then purple as the sky passes through its evening transformations. The priest completes his practice and stands slowly, feeling the blood return to his legs, feeling himself return to ordinary consciousness with its ordinary concerns and ordinary perceptions. He walks out into the temple courtyard where other priests are preparing the evening offering, the meal that will be set before the god statue, the ritual that maintains the relationship between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human, between what was given and what was held back. And as the smoke of the offering rises into the darkening sky, it carries with it all the longing and the wondering and the quiet, persistent question that has followed humanity since the moment the first limitations were imposed. What might we have been? What might we yet become? What sleeps in us still, waiting for the right touch, the right word, the right turning of attention to wake it from its long dream and bring it forth into the light of day? There is a particular quality of silence that settles over a temple precinct in the hours before dawn. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of accumulated presence, the quiet that gathers in a place where prayer and ritual and focused intention have been practiced for generations, where the walls themselves seem to have absorbed something of all the attention that has been directed through them, all the longing and the discipline and the reaching toward something larger than ordinary life. If you sat in such a place and let your own thoughts grow still, you might feel it, a kind of thickness in the air, a density that is not quite physical, a sense that the space around you is more inhabited than it appears. It was in places like this that the priests and priestesses of ancient Mesopotamia preserved what they called the me, a Sumerian word that scholars translate variously as divine laws, sacred powers, civilizational gifts, or the fundamental attributes that make civilization possible. The me were understood as real things, not abstractions, but actual forces or properties that could be held and transferred, and even, in certain myths, stolen. The goddess Inanna famously tricked Enki into giving her the me while he was in a state of relaxed good humour, and then carried them off to her city of Uruk before the god realised what had happened and sent his servants to reclaim them. The story is told with a kind of wry appreciation for Inanna's cleverness, and Enki's somewhat undignified scramble to recover what he had given away too freely. But beneath the narrative surface of this myth lies something that rewards careful attention. The me were a finite set of powers. They could be enumerated, they could be counted. This means that the Sumerian tradition understood the gifts of civilization not as an unlimited abundance, but as a specific, bounded collection of capacities, each one distinct, each one capable of being given and withheld, of being present or absent, of being amplified or reduced. This framework is essential to understanding what the tradition says about the 9 abilities that were diminished in human beings, because it suggests that those abilities were understood not as vague spiritual potentials, but as specific, nameable, real capacities, whose presence or absence made a measurable difference in what a human being could perceive and do. The tradition that speaks most directly about these 9 diminished abilities does not present them in a numbered list. It is not that kind of tradition. It is preserved instead in scattered references across multiple texts, in the symbolic language of myths and hymns and ritual instructions, in the carefully transmitted practices of temple priesthoods, and in the esoteric commentaries that scholars of the ancient world wrote for each other and for their students. Commentaries that took for granted a shared background of knowledge that most ordinary people did not possess. To reconstruct these 9 abilities requires reading across all of these sources simultaneously, letting them speak to one another, allowing the pattern to emerge from the accumulation of references the way a face emerges from a mosaic when you step back far enough to see the whole. The first of these abilities, and in many ways the most fundamental, was the capacity for direct perception of the subtle world, the ability to see and hear and feel presences and forces that operate beneath or beyond the threshold of ordinary sensory experience. The Sumerians called this capacity Namzu, inner knowing, though the term carried connotations that went far beyond what we normally mean by intuition. It was not a vague feeling. It was a precise perceptual faculty, as specific in its operation as sight or hearing, capable of delivering clear, reliable information about aspects of reality that the ordinary senses could not access. In the earliest generations of human beings, according to the tradition, this faculty had operated more or less continuously. People did not have to cultivate it or train it or coax it into activity through special practices. It was simply present, part of the normal background of waking experience, the way peripheral vision is present even when you're not specifically trying to see what is at the edges of your visual field. You could, if you chose to focus, bring it into sharper clarity. But even without focused effort, it provided a continuous stream of background information, a kind of ambient knowing about the state of the world around you that supplemented and enriched ordinary sensory experience. A farmer walking his field in those earliest times would have felt, through this faculty, the health of the soil beneath his feet, the vitality or stress of the plants around him, the presence of underground water, the subtle energies that move through the landscape along lines that the tradition called pathways of the gods. He would have sensed the approach of rain not just from the smell and colour of the sky, but from a kind of inner registering that preceded the physical signs by hours or even days. He would have known, without quite being able to explain how he knew, which of his animals was well and which was sickening, which of his neighbours was troubled and which was at peace, which of the directions he might walk today would lead to something fortunate, and which would not. This capacity was not considered magical by the people who possessed it. It was simply part of how the world worked, part of what it meant to be alive and aware in a reality that was, from the Sumerian perspective, saturated with meaning at every level. The divine was not separate from the natural. The natural was not separate from the personal. Everything was connected, and the faculty of direct perception was simply the human ability to feel those connections, to register the network of relationships that made the world a whole rather than a collection of isolated objects. What reduced this faculty in the generations after the flood, according to the tradition, was not a sudden switching off but a gradual dimming. The change happened slowly enough that no single generation noticed it as a change. Each generation simply accepted its own level of perception as normal, unaware that the previous generation had perceived more richly, and the generation before that more richly still, going all the way back to the founders who had perceived most richly of all. It was like the slow darkening of a room as a fire burns down, the transition so gradual that you adapt to each increment of darkness without realizing how much light you have lost, until finally you reach for something familiar and cannot find it, because you can no longer see clearly enough to know where it is. The second capacity that the tradition identifies as having been diminished was what might be called temporal perception, the ability to sense not just the present moment, but the larger arc of time in which the present moment sits, to feel the weight of the past pressing forward into now and the pull of the future calling the present toward it. This capacity operated through a faculty the texts associate with the liver and the heart, the two organs that Mesopotamian medicine and divination treated as the centers of consciousness and feeling, the organs that knew what the mind had not yet formulated into thought. Divination, the art of reading the future through signs and omens, was one of the most highly developed intellectual traditions of ancient Mesopotamia. Thousands of tablets survive that record the rules of divination, the systems by which the shape of a sheep's liver, the pattern of oil on water, the movement of birds, the appearance of celestial events could be interpreted as messages from the gods about what was coming. This tradition is sometimes dismissed by modern commentators as superstition, as primitive people grasping for certainty in an uncertain world. But within the Mesopotamian framework, it makes a different kind of sense. If human beings once possessed a direct faculty of temporal perception, a genuine ability to sense what was coming, then as that faculty dimmed, they would have needed to develop alternative methods for accessing the same information. Divination was precisely that, a technology for recovering, through systematic observation and interpretation, something of the temporal awareness that had once been immediate and direct. The diviner was not pretending to do something supernatural. He was using a highly refined system of symbol interpretation to do indirectly what the earliest humans had done directly, to read the pattern of events not just in the present moment, but in the larger arc of time. The liver was particularly important in this system because the Mesopotamian tradition understood the liver as the organ that processed life force, that filtered the energies coming into the body from the world around it, and that therefore contained, in its physical form, a record of those energies. A perfectly formed liver, healthy and well-structured, indicated a healthy relationship between the animal and the world, between the subject of the divination and the forces operating around it. Anomalies in the liver's structure indicated disruptions, imbalances, warnings about conditions that were developing in the invisible realm and would soon become visible in the physical one. This logic assumes that the physical and the subtle are always in correspondence, that changes in one level of reality are reflected in changes at other levels, that nothing happens in the visible world that does not first take form in the invisible. This assumption was not peculiar to Mesopotamia. It appears in one form or another in nearly every ancient culture that developed a sophisticated cosmological tradition, and it was not, from the perspective of those traditions, merely a belief. It was an observable fact, confirmed by the consistent results that divination produced when practiced by skilled and disciplined practitioners. The third capacity was the ability to communicate with the non-human world, not just with the gods but with the animals, the plants, the stones, the rivers, the wind itself. The tradition speaks of a time when these communications were natural and unremarkable, when a person could speak to an animal and understand its response, not in the sense of translating animal sounds into human words, but in the deeper sense of sharing a common medium of awareness through which intention and feeling and information could pass without the intermediary of language. This capacity was closely related to the first, the faculty of direct perception, but it had a specific outward orientation. It was not just about receiving impressions from the world around you, but about establishing a genuine dialogue with the non-human presences in that world, treating them as subjects rather than objects, as participants in a shared reality rather than as backdrop to the human drama. The gods themselves were understood to move through the natural world in the forms of animals and weather patterns and geological features, and the ability to communicate with these manifestations was therefore also an ability to communicate with the divine in its immanent form, the form in which it was most immediately accessible to human beings going about their daily lives. A shepherd in the earliest generations, the texts hint, did not merely tend his flock in the way a modern farmer tends livestock. He was in genuine relationship with his animals, aware of their individual personalities and states, able to read their behavior as fluently as he might read a written text, capable of communicating his own intentions to them through means that went beyond gesture and sound and habit. The relationship was mutually beneficial in ways that went beyond the obvious economic ones. The animals, in the presence of someone with this capacity, were calmer, healthier, more productive. The land around them, responded to, acknowledged, participated in, was more fertile and more generous. Everything worked better when the communication was real. The fourth capacity was intimately connected to the human relationship with sound and vibration. The tradition speaks of a time when human beings understood the deep structure of sound, not just as a medium of communication, but as a fundamental force in the organization of reality. This understanding expressed itself in chant, in prayer, in the singing that accompanied ritual, in the particular tones and rhythms used to address the gods in their temples. But it went beyond the use of sound in formal religious contexts. It was an awareness of how sound shaped the space it moved through, how certain frequencies resonated with certain aspects of the subtle world, how the intentional use of the voice could influence states of consciousness, the health of the body, the energetic quality of a place. The Sumerian hymns to various gods, many of which survive on clay tablets, are not merely literary works. They are precise sonic technologies, composed with careful attention to rhythm and repetition, and the particular emotional and energetic states that certain combinations of sounds would produce in a skilled practitioner. To read them as poetry alone is to miss most of their purpose. They were instruments, tools for aligning the human system with the divine one, for opening the channels of perception and communication that connected the human world to the larger reality in which it was embedded. The loss of this capacity meant not just that people became less able to use sound intentionally, but that they became less sensitive to the sonic dimensions of reality itself. The world grew quieter in a particular way, not because there was less sound, but because less of the sound that was always present was being consciously received and understood. The deep hum of the earth, the resonant frequencies that moved through stone and water, the harmonic relationships between different kinds of natural sound, all of this retreated from common awareness into the province of specialists, of musicians and priests and healers who maintained, through their professional disciplines, something of the sonic sensitivity that had once been universal. The fifth capacity was perhaps the most practically significant for daily life. It was the ability to heal, not through the application of external remedies alone, but through the direct influence of one Sumerian text describes as the life force itself, the animating energy that the gods had breathed into human beings at the moment of creation, and that continued to sustain them as long as it flowed freely through the body's channels. The earliest healers in Mesopotamian tradition were not primarily herbalists or surgeons, though they used herbs and surgical techniques when appropriate. They were primarily energy workers, people who could perceive the subtle body directly, identify disruptions and blockages in the flow of life force, and correct them through a combination of touch, sound, focused intention, and ritual procedure. The tablets that describe healing practice in ancient Mesopotamia include both practical pharmacological information and ritual instructions that presuppose a model of the body quite different from the modern biomedical one. The body in this model is not just a physical machine, but a complex system of interconnected channels and centers through which life force flows in patterns that can be harmonious or disrupted, balanced or imbalanced. Disease arises when the flow is disrupted, and healing is the restoration of harmonious flow. The healer's task is to perceive the disruption, understand its cause, and apply the appropriate combination of techniques to restore balance. In the earliest generations, when the capacity for direct perception was still strong, and the connection between the human body and the larger patterns of the cosmos was still felt clearly, this kind of healing was accessible to a relatively large number of people. Parents could heal their children, elders could heal their communities. The knowledge was not restricted to specialists because it did not require years of specialized training to access. It was simply part of what an attentive, present human being could do when they were in full contact with their own subtle nature and with the subtle nature of the world around them. As the faculty of direct perception dimmed, healing became more restricted and more technical. The practitioner needed years of training to develop enough sensitivity to perceive what a healthy person had once perceived naturally. The procedures needed to be codified and standardized because they could no longer be improvised on the basis of direct apprehension. The knowledge needed to be written down because the living transmission from teacher to student was no longer sufficient to maintain it through all the subtle nuances that made the difference between genuine effectiveness and mere ceremony. The sixth capacity was the ability to navigate between states of consciousness with freedom and intention, to move from ordinary waking awareness into dream, vision, trance, or what the Mesopotamian texts call the descent to the underworld, a metaphor for a kind of inward journey that took the practitioner into regions of awareness that were not accessible from the ordinary waking state, and to return from those regions with knowledge and perspective that could be applied to practical situations in the waking world. This capacity was closely related to what later traditions would call shamanism, though the Mesopotamian version of it was embedded in a highly organized religious system with its own specific techniques and its own specific understanding of what was being done and why. The descent narratives preserved in Mesopotamian literature, the most famous of which is the descent of the goddess Inanna into the underworld and her eventual return, can be read on multiple levels simultaneously, as myth, as theological statement, as cosmological description, and also as an encoded account of a specific practice, a way of moving consciousness into altered states and navigating those states according to a carefully developed map of the inner landscape. The 7 gates through which Inanna passes on her way down, at each of which she must surrender one of her divine attributes, correspond in the esoteric reading to specific stages in the withdrawal of ordinary consciousness from its familiar anchors, each stage requiring a surrender of a particular way of seeing or knowing or being that is characteristic of the ordinary waking state. The practitioner who could perform this descent and return brought back gifts, knowledge of the dead, and of what lay beyond death, understanding of the hidden causes of events that appeared mysterious or random from the ordinary perspective, access to sources of wisdom and guidance that were not available from within the ordinary framework of waking consciousness. In the earliest times, this capacity was relatively widespread, part of the general heritage of human awareness. Later, it became increasingly rare and increasingly the province of specially trained and initiated specialists whose work on behalf of the community required this unusual degree of mobility between states. The 7th capacity was what the tradition describes as the ability to participate in the creative power of the cosmos, to bring new things into existence not just through physical labor and craft, but through the directed power of will and imagination, an intentional alignment with the creative forces that were always moving through the world. This is perhaps the most difficult of the 9 capacities to describe in terms that do not sound either magical or naively wishful, but the tradition is consistent and specific enough in its references to it that dismissing it as mere fantasy would be premature. The gods created the world through a combination of will and word and action. Enki, in particular, was credited with a mode of creation that operated through the focused power of his divine intelligence, his ability to envision something so clearly and completely that it simply came into being in alignment with his vision. The texts describe him as knowing the fate of things before they happen, as being able to name things into existence, as working in a mode of creation that was qualitatively different from the physical labor of digging and shaping and building. Human beings, made from divine material, were said to have inherited something of this creative power, though in a much diluted form. The earliest people, those closest to the original act of creation, could shape reality more directly through their focused attention and intention than later people could. This did not mean they could do whatever they wished without effort or consequence, but it did mean that their mental and intentional states had a more direct and immediate effect on the world around them, that what they strongly envisioned was more likely to manifest, that their collective attention and intention could influence weather, fertility, the behavior of animals, the course of rivers, the success or failure of harvests. As this capacity diminished, the gap between intention and outcome widened. The human mind became less directly causative and more reactive, more shaped by its environment than shaping it. The creative power that had once flowed relatively freely through human awareness retreated into specialists, into the artists and craftspeople and musicians and visionaries who found, through the intensity of their creative engagement, partial access to the larger creative force that all human beings had once participated in more fully. The 8th capacity was perhaps the most intimate and the most quietly devastating in its loss. It was the capacity for complete presence, the ability to be fully and simultaneously aware of the past, the present, and the larger pattern, of which both were part, without the fragmentation that characterizes ordinary human consciousness. In ordinary awareness, attention moves from one thing to another, from the present moment to a memory, from memory to anticipation, from anticipation back to the present but already edging toward the next moment, never fully resting anywhere, always partial, always incomplete. This fragmentation is so familiar that most people experience it as simply the nature of consciousness itself as the way awareness works. but the tradition insists it is not. In the earliest humans, consciousness was whole, in a way that later generations would only glimpse in moments of deep meditation, or artistic absorption, or the sudden unexpected clarity that sometimes comes in the final moments before sleep. The world was perceived all at once, in its full depth and breadth and interconnection, without the selective narrowing that ordinary attention requires. This did not mean the early people were overwhelmed by sensation, quite the opposite. Because their consciousness was whole, it could hold more without becoming confused. It could maintain awareness of many things simultaneously, and still find meaning in each one, the way a skilled musician can follow and appreciate 5 different voices in a polyphonic composition, while an untrained listener can follow only one at a time. The loss of this wholeness was experienced not as a sudden subtraction, but as an increasing tendency to see parts rather than wholes, to focus on single threads at the expense of the weaving, to understand the tree but lose sight of the forest, the word but lose the poem, the action but lose the intention that gave it meaning. This fragmentation of consciousness was, in a sense, a necessary adaptation to the conditions of post-Diluvian life, which required intense focus on specific practical tasks for survival. But it came at a cost, the cost of the larger picture, the deep context, the felt sense of participation in a reality that was coherent and meaningful all the way down. The 9th capacity is the one that the tradition mentions most rarely and most guardedly, as though even to speak of it required a kind of care that the other 8 did not. It was the capacity for what might be called full continuity of being, the awareness that persisted not just across the span of a single lifetime, but across the boundary that ordinary experience knows as death. The earliest humans, the texts hint, were not unaware of death. They knew that bodies ended, but they were also aware, through direct experience rather than through belief or faith or philosophical reasoning, that consciousness was not the same thing as the body, and did not end when the body ended. This was not an article of religious doctrine for them. It was a perceived reality, as directly known as the fact that the sun rises in the east, the knowledge of continuity of being shaped everything about how those earliest people lived. It changed their relationship to time, because time was no longer the desperate race against extinction that it would become for later generations who experienced death as a final ending rather than a transition. It changed their relationship to each other, because they knew that the bonds formed in one life were not severed by death, but continued in a form that was different but not less real. It changed their relationship to the gods, because the gulf between divine and human, measured in terms of immortality, was not as absolute as it would later appear. The gods did not die, but neither in the deepest sense did human beings. As this awareness faded, death became something different. It became an absolute boundary, a wall beyond which nothing was known and nothing could be guaranteed. The anxiety this generated was enormous. It reshaped human culture in ways that are still visible today, in the obsession with legacy, with monuments, with the preservation of names and deeds for future generations, with the accumulation of wealth and power as buffers against the terrifying fact of impermanence. The enormous energy that human beings began to devote to coping with the existential reality of death, energy that had previously been available for other purposes, became one of the defining features of post-Diluvian civilization. The temples and ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia were, among other things, responses to this anxiety. To build something large and permanent was to assert continuity in the face of personal impermanence, to say that even if the builder did not last, the building would, and something of the builder's presence would persist in the structure and the name associated with it. The great Sumerian king Gilgamesh, whose legendary search for immortality forms one of the most moving narratives in all of ancient literature, can be understood against this background. His quest was not merely personal vanity or fear of death. It was a reaching back toward a knowledge that had once been common, a desperate attempt to recover the direct experiential certainty of continuity that his ancestors had possessed, and that he, brilliant and powerful as he was, could not access through any of the means available to him. And yet, even as these 9 capacities faded in the general population, they did not disappear entirely. They persisted in the margins, in the practices of temple schools and mystery traditions, in the disciplines of certain lineages that maintained the old knowledge with stubborn faithfulness across the centuries. They persisted too in the body itself, encoded in the physical and subtle structure of human beings, in ways that were no longer consciously accessible, but that had not been erased, only covered over. The tradition speaks of this as a sealing rather than a destruction. The capacities were not removed. They were contained, placed in a kind of dormancy, available in principle to anyone who could find the key, but requiring a degree of effort and discipline and commitment that the ordinary conditions of post-diluvian life made very difficult to sustain. A woman who lives in the city of Nippur, perhaps 1500 years after the flood traditions placed the Great Inundation, wakes before dawn every morning and goes to a small room in the back of her house, where she sits in darkness and practices what her teacher called the returning. It is a discipline she has followed for 20 years, since she was first initiated into the inner circle of the temple school, where she serves as an administrator and teacher of young women. The returning is exactly what it sounds like, a systematic attempt to reverse the dimming, to recover step by patient step, the perceptual clarity that the tradition says all human beings once possessed. She begins with breath. Not ordinary breathing, but a specific pattern of inhale and pause and exhale that was given to her by her teacher, and that she has practiced so many thousands of times that it now begins automatically when she settles into her seat in the dark room. As the pattern establishes itself, her body shifts. The restlessness of early waking fades. The thoughts that usually fill the first moments of the day, plans for the day's work, the small anxieties about students and resources and temple politics, quieter and then grow quieter still, until finally there is a quality of interior silence that is not emptiness, but the opposite of emptiness, a fullness that is also a transparency, a state in which awareness is present but not occupied by its usual contents. From this place of interior quiet, she extends her attention outward, slowly and carefully, the way you might extend a hand into a dark pool to feel what is there without disturbing the surface. She feels the walls of the room around her, the texture of the mud brick, its thermal mass still holding the warmth of the previous day. She feels the house beyond the room, her sleeping children in the next room, their breathing slow and deep. She feels the street outside, the pre-dawn quiet, a dog sleeping against a wall, a cat moving along a rooftop, the slight stirring of the air that will become the morning breeze. She feels the city beyond the street, its sleeping weight, the density of human lives pressed close together in that small geographic space. And then, if the conditions are right, if her practice has been consistent and her state is clear, she feels something more, something beneath and behind the ordinary fabric of sensation, a kind of ground tone that underlies everything, the deep hum of the world's own being, the presence that the texts call the breath of the god, the animating force that moves through all things and connects them, and that is, the tradition insists, the same force that moved through the first human beings when the gods first breathed into them and called them alive. She does not feel this every morning. On many mornings she sits for an hour and rises feeling only the ordinary stiffness of her body and the ordinary texture of her thoughts, no different from any other woman in any other house in the city. But on the mornings when it comes, when the thread connects and she feels for a moment the world as it truly is beneath its surface, she carries that feeling through the rest of the day like a lamp held inside her chest, warming everything it touches, making everything a little more transparent, a little more alive, a little more connected to the large reality that hums beneath the surface of the ordinary world. She does not tell most people about this practice. It would not be understood. The world she lives in is pragmatic, oriented toward survival and production, and the management of complex social systems. Mystical experience, however genuine, is not a practical asset in the marketplace or the administrative office. She teaches it to her students, carefully and gradually, those few among them who show the particular quality of attention that suggests they might be able to benefit from it, and she hopes that they will teach it to their students in turn, and those students to theirs, so that the thread does not break, so that the knowledge survives, so that when the time comes and the conditions are right, it will be available to whoever needs it, whoever is ready for it, whoever can take it up and carry it forward. The stars outside her window are beginning to fade as the sky to the east lightens almost imperceptibly. The city around her is still mostly asleep, but in a few hours it will be fully awake, noisy and purposeful and practical, filled with the 10,000 necessary activities that keep human civilization functioning, and she will be in the middle of it, doing her part, managing her responsibilities, living the ordinary life of an ordinary woman in an ancient city. Only she knows what happens in the darkroom before dawn. Only she and her students and a small network of similar practitioners scattered through the cities of Mesopotamia know that the knowledge has not been entirely lost, that the seals can be loosened though not entirely broken, that the 9 capacities still exist in the human body like seeds in winter soil, waiting for the warmth and the light and the water that will allow them to send up their green shoots again into the air of the living world. The morning star appears above the eastern horizon, bright and steady, the last star visible as the sky grows pale around it. And somewhere beneath the earth of the ancient city, in foundations laid by hands that are now dust, the old tablets rest in their clay cases, sealed with clay stoppers impressed with the seals of the priests who made them, waiting with all the patience of fired clay for the hands that will one day lift them into the light and read what has been preserved through all the long centuries of forgetting. There is a particular kind of knowledge that survives, not because it was protected, but because it was hidden in plain sight, folded into stories that seem to be about other things entirely, encoded in rituals whose surface meaning distracted attention from the deeper purpose they served, preserved in the bodies of practitioners who carried it not as information but as capacity, the way a hand carries the memory of a craft long after the mind has forgotten the instructions that first taught it. This is how the knowledge of the Anunnaki survived the long centuries of change and conquest and cultural transformation that followed the great flowering of Sumerian civilization. Not in vaults or secret chambers, though those existed too, but in the living tissue of human practice, passed from teacher to student, mother to daughter, elder to initiate, across a chain of transmission so long and so carefully maintained that the knowledge arrived in later centuries still vital, still capable of producing results, still pointing toward the same original source. The world that surrounded this transmission was changing. By the time the Akkadian Empire rose to replace the fragmented city-states of Sumer as the dominant political force in Mesopotamia, the cultural landscape had shifted considerably. The Akkadian language was gradually displacing Sumerian as the primary medium of everyday communication, though Sumerian remained the language of religion and scholarship, preserved in the scribal schools with the same kind of careful reverence that Latin would later be preserved in European monasteries long after it had ceased to be a living vernacular. The gods kept their Sumerian names in the temple rituals. The hymns continued to be sung in Sumerian syllables whose full meaning was no longer understood by most of the people who sang them, but whose sonic qualities, the particular vibrations of those ancient words in human mouths, were understood by the tradition to be as important as the semantic content, perhaps more important. The Akkadian rulers who succeeded the Sumerian city-state administrators were ambitious builders and administrators. They created an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south to the mountains of Anatolia in the north, connecting trade routes that carried not just goods but ideas, religious concepts, artistic traditions, medical knowledge, astronomical observations. The great Sargon of Akkad, whose career represents one of the most dramatic rises to power in all of ancient history, is said in later traditions to have been guided by the favour of the goddess Ishtar, the Akkadian name for the Sumerian Inanna, and to have possessed a particular sensitivity to divine guidance that allowed him to make decisions that defied ordinary military logic but consistently proved correct. Whether this was divine favour in the literal sense his tradition intended, or whether it represented a highly developed capacity for pattern recognition and intuitive strategic thinking that drew on information his conscious mind could not fully articulate, the result was the same. He seemed to know things he should not have known. He seemed to see around corners. He acted on information that had no apparent source. This quality of knowing was recognized and valued in the ancient world in a way that it is not always recognized and valued in the modern one. The Mesopotamian tradition had a specific concept for it, something the texts call the divine ear, the capacity to hear what the gods were saying, not through priests or oracles or formal divination procedures, but directly, in the quiet moments between one thought and the next when the mind was still enough to receive what was being offered. Kings were expected to have this capacity. Indeed, the legitimacy of kingship was understood to rest in part on the ruler's ability to maintain a living connection with the divine realm, to receive guidance and transmit it to his people in the form of just and effective governance. The royal rituals of Mesopotamia were elaborate precisely because they needed to maintain and regularly refresh this connection. The king was not born divine, he was made divine through ritual, through the sacred marriage ceremony in which the king took the role of the shepherd god Dumuzi and the high priestess took the role of Inanna, and through their union the fertility and vitality of the land was renewed for another year. He was confirmed divine through the regular offerings and rituals that kept him in relationship with the divine realm, and he could lose this divine connection through impiety, through injustice, through the failure to maintain the ritual obligations that formed the terms of the relationship. This is the political theology of Mesopotamia, and it is deeply relevant to the story of the 9 diminished capacities, because it reveals how central those capacities were to the entire structure of civilization. If the king's legitimate authority derived from his maintained connection with the divine, then the weakening of that connection through the dimming of human perceptual capacities was not merely a spiritual matter, it was a political and social matter of the first order. A king who could no longer genuinely receive divine guidance was a king whose authority rested on ceremony alone, on the performance of a connection that was no longer real. And a civilization whose leadership was performing rather than actually embodying a relationship with the divine was a civilization resting on increasingly unstable ground. The tension between performance and reality runs through the later centuries of Mesopotamian history in ways that the historical record documents, even if it does not always interpret in these terms. The great kings of the Akkadian, Ur-Thur, and Old Babylonian periods were also the greatest builders of temple complexes, the most lavish sponsors of religious ritual, the most insistent on the divine legitimation of their rule. This insistence, this need to prove and demonstrate and elaborate what in earlier times had simply been assumed, is itself a symptom of something changing. When something is genuinely present, it does not need to be argued for at such length. By the time of the Old Babylonian period, roughly the time when Hammurabi established his famous law code and brought most of Mesopotamia under a single centralized authority, the scribal traditions had developed an extraordinary richness and sophistication. The libraries of the great temples contained thousands of tablets covering astronomy, medicine, divination, mythology, history, literature, law, and the practical arts of agriculture and administration. The knowledge preserved in these libraries represented the accumulated intellectual labour of more than 1,000 years of civilization, and it was maintained with a seriousness and a commitment to accuracy that would impress any modern archivist. But something was missing from this vast accumulation, or rather, something had shifted in its relationship to what was being preserved. The earliest tablets had been written by people for whom the knowledge they recorded was living knowledge, knowledge they used and practiced and experienced. The tablets of the later period were increasingly the work of scholars for whom the knowledge was historical, inherited, respected, and faithfully preserved, but no longer necessarily directly experienced. The gap between knowing about something and actually doing it, between studying the descriptions of a capacity and actually possessing that capacity, was widening with each generation. The scribal schools of the Old Babylonian period were remarkable institutions. Young men, and occasionally young women, entered them as children and spent years learning the complex art of cuneiform writing, the vast catalogue of signs that had to be memorized and mastered before any serious intellectual work could begin. They copied the standard curriculum text over and over, the great myths and king lists and mathematical tables and legal formularies that formed the foundation of Mesopotamian intellectual culture. They were trained to be precise, to be faithful to their sources, to preserve exactly what they had received without unauthorized alteration or embellishment. This training produced extraordinarily reliable transmitters of the tradition. The scribes of the Old Babylonian period copied the Sumerian texts they had inherited with a faithfulness that modern scholars, when they compare multiple copies of the same text, find remarkable. They preserved what they did not understand alongside what they did, treating both with equal care, trusting that accuracy was more important than comprehension, and this faithfulness meant that the hints and fragments and encoded references to the 9 diminished capacities survived into the later tradition even when the people preserving them no longer knew exactly what they referred to or why they mattered. The Great Omen series, the collections of divination texts that were assembled and standardized during the Old Babylonian period and elaborated further in subsequent centuries, contain within their vast catalogues of signs and their interpretations a map of human perceptual capacity that reveals itself slowly to anyone reading with the right kind of attention. The omens assume that the world is constantly communicating, that every event is also a message, that nothing happens in isolation but everything happens within a web of meaning that connects the individual event to larger patterns and to the intentions of the divine beings who manage those patterns. To read this assumption carefully is to recognize in it a residue of the original capacity for direct perception, now expressed not as living experience, but as intellectual framework, not as immediate knowing, but as systematic method for inferring what can no longer be directly perceived. The healers of the old Babylonian period similarly preserved in their medical and magical texts the framework of the original healing capacity, even as the living practice of that capacity had become increasingly rare and increasingly difficult to access without years of specialized training. The tablets describe the subtle body, the channels and centers and flows of life force, with a precision that presupposes direct observation. The remedies and procedures prescribed operate on both the physical and the subtle levels simultaneously, assuming that the healer can perceive and work with both. But the very fact that all of this had to be written down and systematized and taught through formal instruction, rather than transmitted through direct demonstration and direct experience, reveals the distance that had grown between the tradition and its original living ground. Meanwhile, to the north and east and west, other civilizations were rising that had their own versions of the same story, their own traditions about a time when human beings had been different, when the divine and the human had been closer, when capacities now lost or diminished had been part of common experience. The Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, the age of the gods when the divine beings had walked on earth and ruled directly before withdrawing into the invisible realm and leaving human pharaohs to represent them. The traditions of the Indus Valley, preserved in the later Vedic texts, spoke of the 4 ages of the world, each one a step down from the previous, each one characterized by a reduction in human virtue, longevity, and capacity. The Hebrew tradition spoke of the antediluvian patriarchs who lived for hundreds of years and maintained a direct relationship with the divine that later generations could only approach through prayer and ritual and the mediation of prophets. All of these traditions agree on the basic shape of the story. There was a time when things were different, when human beings were more, when the gap between the divine and the human was smaller. And something happened that changed this, that introduced the limitations and the fragmentation and the forgetting that characterize the human condition as we know it now. The details vary, the names change, the specific mechanisms of the change are described differently in different traditions. But the fact of the change, the sense that humanity is operating below its original specifications, that certain features of the original design have been disabled or locked away, is remarkably consistent. This consistency across cultures that developed largely independently of one another is itself a kind of evidence. Not proof in the rigorous modern scientific sense, but the kind of evidence that demands to be taken seriously. When people in Mesopotamia and Egypt and India and ancient China and the traditions of the indigenous Americas all independently arrive at the same basic story about a lost golden age of human capacity, the most reasonable response is not immediate dismissal but careful inquiry. Why does this story keep appearing? What experience or memory or observation generates it? What does it point to, even if we cannot quite see yet what it points at? The Anunnaki tradition from ancient Sumer is simply the oldest written version of this widespread human intuition. It is the most detailed. It is the one that gives names and specific actions and specific mechanisms. And it is the one that most explicitly frames the diminishment of human capacity not as an accident or a natural process of decline, but as a deliberate decision made by specific beings for specific reasons. This framing is either the most important thing about the tradition or the least important, depending on how you read it. It may be that the personification of cosmic processes as deliberate agents is simply the way ancient minds made sense of impersonal dynamics, or it may be that the tradition is preserving, in the only language available to it, an accurate account of something that actually happened, a real intervention in the development of human consciousness whose effects are still being felt today. As the second millennium before the Common Era moved into its middle centuries, the political landscape of the ancient Near East grew increasingly turbulent. The Hittites pressed down from the north. The Mitanni controlled the region between Mesopotamia and the Levantine coast. Egypt under the New Kingdom pharaohs extended its reach into Canaan and Syria. The great trading cities of the Mediterranean coast, Ugarit and Byblos and others, served as crossroads where the cultural traditions of all these civilizations met and mingled and influenced each other. And in this mixing, the stories that each civilization carried about the divine origins of humanity and the lost capacities of the earliest people were shared, compared, and woven together into new syntheses. The mythological texts from Ugarit, discovered in the 20th century and only partially deciphered, contain elements that seem to connect the Mesopotamian Anunnaki tradition to the Canaanite divine council, the assembly of the gods that appears in slightly altered form in the Hebrew Bible, in the Psalms that speak of God standing in the divine assembly and judging among the gods, in the passage from Genesis where the divine beings look upon the daughters of men and find them beautiful, in the book of Job where the heavenly court convenes and the adversarial figure presents himself before the divine assembly. These connections suggest that the tradition was not limited to Mesopotamia, but had spread through the entire ancient Near East, adapted to local languages and local concerns, but maintaining its essential shape. The city of Nippur, in central Mesopotamia, was perhaps the most important religious centre of the ancient Sumerian world. The city where Enlil had his great temple, and where the assembly of the gods was understood to meet when decisions of cosmic importance were being made. The temple complex at Nippur contained one of the most extensive archives of cuneiform tablets ever assembled, a library that covered every aspect of Mesopotamian intellectual life, and that was maintained for centuries by an unbroken succession of scribal families, who considered the preservation of this knowledge their sacred duty. When scholars excavated Nippur in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found thousands of tablets that had survived the millennia in the dry soil, a treasure of human thought that had been waiting underground for more than 2,000 years. Among these tablets were texts that described, in various ways and with various degrees of directness, the nature and purposes of the Anunnaki and their relationship with humanity. Some of these texts were mythological narratives, some were hymns, some were ritual instructions, some were what scholars call wisdom literature, reflective texts that consider the human condition and its relationship to the divine order in terms that go beyond simple storytelling into something closer to philosophical inquiry. These wisdom texts are particularly revealing because they often express, with a directness that the mythological narratives do not, the sense of loss and limitation that the post-Diluvian human condition represented. One recurring theme in this wisdom literature is the complaint that human beings do not know their own fate, cannot see what is coming, cannot understand why things happen as they do. This complaint is not merely personal or emotional. It is framed as a structural feature of the human condition, a built-in limitation that the texts accept as real and permanent even while they mourn it. The gods know, human beings do not. This asymmetry is presented as fundamental, as part of the design, and the appropriate human response to it is not rebellion but acceptance, combined with the diligent use of whatever partial tools for knowledge are available, divination, dream interpretation, careful observation of omens, and the cultivation of right relationship with the divine through ritual and prayer and moral living. But the wisdom texts also preserve, between the lines of their acceptance, a kind of wistfulness, a sense that this limitation is not entirely natural, not entirely as it should be, that something genuine has been lost, and that the loss is real even if its recovery is beyond the capacity of any ordinary person in any ordinary lifetime. This wistfulness is the emotional residue of the tradition about the 9 diminished capacities. It is what the story feels like from the inside, when you're a scribe in Nippur copying an ancient text about a time when human beings could perceive and do things that you yourself cannot perceive or do, and you feel the distance between that description and your own daily experience as a kind of ache, a nostalgia for something you never personally had but that nevertheless feels like something lost. The great empires that rose and fell across Mesopotamia in the 2nd and 1st millennia, before the Common Era, each had their own relationship to this tradition. The Assyrian Empire, fierce and militaristic, nevertheless maintained vast libraries at Nineveh and other cities, where the old Sumerian and Babylonian texts were carefully preserved and studied. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century before the Common Era, and whose library at Nineveh was rediscovered by 19th century archaeologists and became one of the most important single finds in the history of Assyriology, took a personal interest in ancient texts and commissioned the collection of tablets from temples and private archives across the empire. Among the texts assembled in his library were the earliest versions of the Gilgamesh epic that survive today, along with vast collections of omens, medical texts, hymns, and mythological narratives that together represent the most comprehensive, single archive of Mesopotamian intellectual tradition that was ever assembled in the ancient world. Ashurbanipal was, by the standards of his day, a scholar. He claimed in his own inscriptions to be able to read the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian texts himself, without the assistance of a scribe, a claim that was either genuinely true or a powerful political statement about the kind of ruler he wished to be seen as. He understood that the knowledge preserved in these texts was not merely historical curiosity, but living resource, that the techniques of divination and healing and ritual preserved on clay tablets were as useful and relevant as they had ever been, provided you had the training to apply them correctly. But even Ashurbanipal, with all the resources of a great empire at his disposal, and a genuine personal commitment to the preservation and study of the ancient knowledge, could not fully recover what had been lost. He could copy the texts, he could train scribes to understand them, he could maintain the rituals with great accuracy and great expense. But the direct perceptual capacities that the texts described, the living experience of the world as a saturated, meaningful whole, the direct commerce with the divine that the earliest generations had known, these remained as inaccessible to him as to any other human being of his time, available at most in glimpses and fragments, in the rare moments of genuine religious experience that even the most elaborate ritual machinery could not reliably produce on demand. The fall of Nineveh in 612 before the Common Era, when a coalition of Babylonians and Medes sacked the great Assyrian capital and burned its palace complex to the ground, destroyed much of Ashurbanipal's library but not all of it. The clay tablets, being fireproof, survived the burning of the wooden shelves that held them. They fell to the floor and were covered by the ash and rubble of the collapsed building, and lay there for more than 2.5 millennia, waiting. When Austin Henry Layard and his colleagues began excavating the mound of Kuyunjik in the 1840s and 1850s, they found the tablets in their thousands, pressed together in layers, many of them broken but most of them still legible, still carrying in their fired clay the words that ancient scribes had pressed there in the 7th century before the Common Era, and that those scribes had copied from still older tablets going back centuries further still. The words that came up from the ground with those tablets were words about the Anunnaki, about creation, about the flood, about the relationship between gods and human beings, and the terms of that relationship and what had been given and what had been withheld, about a time when things had been different, about capacities that sleep in the human body like banked coals, dimmed but not extinguished, waiting for the breath that will bring them back to flame. The Neo-Babylonian period, which followed the Assyrian collapse, saw a remarkable revival of interest in the oldest layers of the tradition. The Babylonian king Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar, who between them established a new empire centered on the ancient city of Babylon, were both deeply invested in the religious and cultural heritage of Mesopotamia. Nebuchadnezzar's building program at Babylon included the reconstruction of the great ziggurat Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, which later tradition would associate with the Tower of Babel. This ziggurat, rising in 7 great stepped terraces above the flat plain of the Euphrates Valley, was understood as a physical connection between the earthly and the divine realms, a structure whose very form encoded the cosmological model of 7 heavens, corresponding to the 7 visible celestial bodies, whose top terrace housed a chamber where the god Marduk was understood to reside, and where, on certain sacred occasions, the most senior priests might approach most closely to the divine presence. The ziggurat was, among other things, a technology, not in the mechanical sense, but in the sense of a structured intervention in the relationship between the human and the divine, a carefully designed environment that used form and proportion and orientation and the accumulated sanctity of generations of ritual use to create conditions in which the thinned boundary between worlds might be approached more closely. To climb the ziggurat was to rehearse the ascent from the earthly to the divine. To stand at the top was to be for a moment in a place that was both on earth and not entirely of it, a threshold, a liminal zone where the rules that governed ordinary experience were slightly different, and things that were normally impossible became slightly less so. The priests who served the great temples of Neo-Babylonian Babylon were the heirs of a tradition of training that had been maintained for more than 2,000 years. Their education began in childhood and continued throughout their lives. They studied the ancient texts in multiple languages. They learned the rituals and the theology and the astronomical observations on which the sacred calendar depended. They practiced the disciplines of purification and concentration that were understood to be prerequisites for genuine contact with the divine. And some of them, the ones who showed the particular quality of sustained attention and genuine interior development that the tradition required, went further. They entered the inner circles of the mystery traditions that had preserved, across all the centuries of political change and cultural transformation, something of the living knowledge that went back to the very beginning. What exactly was preserved in these inner circles, what practices were taught, and what experiences were sought and sometimes achieved, is not recorded in the tablets that survive from the public libraries of the great temples. The mystery traditions, by definition, did not write down their most essential content. The outer form could be written, the ritual procedures, the mythological framework, the astronomical calculations, the pharmacological knowledge, these were committed to clay and preserved in the archives. But the interior experience, the direct knowing that distinguished the initiated practitioner from the learned scholar, was transmitted only through direct person-to-person contact, from the teacher who had attained the experience to the student who was ready to receive it, in a transmission that required physical presence and genuine relationship, and a degree of mutual trust that no written record could substitute for. This is why the knowledge was always vulnerable. Every generation that could not find adequate teachers, every period of political upheaval that disrupted the institutions within which the transmission was maintained, every shift of cultural values that made the practice seem irrelevant or dangerous or foolish, was a potential break in the chain, and breaks did occur. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, while less destructive to the physical infrastructure of Babylonian civilization than the Assyrian sack of Nineveh had been, nevertheless disrupted the temple institutions and the scribal schools that had maintained the tradition. Persian rule brought new ideas, new religious frameworks, new ways of thinking about the divine and its relationship to humanity that were not always compatible with the old Mesopotamian models. The Greek conquest under Alexander in 331 before the Common Era brought another wave of disruption and transformation. The Seleucid period that followed saw an extraordinary mixing of Greek and Mesopotamian intellectual traditions that produced some remarkable syntheses. The astrology that developed in this period, drawing on both the Babylonian astronomical tradition and the Greek philosophical framework to create something that was neither purely Babylonian nor purely Greek, but something new, a hybrid form that would prove enormously influential throughout the ancient world. But it also saw the gradual abandonment of cuneiform, writing in favour of the more economical Aramaic alphabet, a shift that had profound consequences for the preservation of the old knowledge. Cuneiform was difficult to learn and required expensive materials. As it fell out of common use, the ancient texts became inaccessible to all but a small number of specialists who maintained the skill of reading them. And as those specialists died without adequate successors, the text fell silent, waiting in the earth for rediscoverers who would not come for 2,000 years. The last known cuneiform tablet was written in 75 of the Common Era, a text related to astronomical observation. By that time, the culture that had produced cuneiform writing had been effectively over for centuries, replaced by the successive cultures of the Persian, Greek and Parthian empires that had ruled Mesopotamia since the fall of Babylon. The great libraries were gone, the scribal schools were gone, the temple institutions that had maintained the mystery traditions were gone. What remained was fragmentary, scattered, partially preserved in the Greek and Aramaic texts that had absorbed some elements of the Babylonian tradition, partially preserved in the practices of Jewish and later Mandaean communities that had maintained elements of the old ritual and cosmological framework within their own religious contexts, partially preserved in the esoteric traditions that would eventually flow into Gnosticism and Neoplatonism and the various mystery schools of the Hellenistic and Roman periods. The Gnostic traditions that flourished in the first centuries of the Common Era are particularly interesting in this context, because they preserve, in strikingly explicit form, a version of the Anunnaki story that is clearly related to the older Mesopotamian tradition, even if it comes wrapped in a very different cultural and linguistic package. The Gnostic texts, many of which were discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, speak of a creator god or group of creator gods called the Demiurge or the Archons, who fashioned human beings from material they did not fully understand, trapping divine light, a spark of true awareness, within a physical form that limited and constrained it. The Archons are, in this reading, a version of the Anunnaki, beings of considerable power but not of ultimate wisdom, who created humanity for their own purposes and who maintain their control over the human world by keeping human beings ignorant of their true nature and their true potential. The Gnostic solution was knowledge, gnosis, direct experiential knowing of one's divine nature, the recognition that the divine spark within each person was not created by the archons and not subject to their control, that it came from a higher source, and that awakening to this fact was itself a form of liberation. This is a spiritualized and interiorized version of the same story the Mesopotamian tablets tell, translated from the cosmological language of gods and floods and councils into the psychological language of inner awakening and self-recognition. The outer narrative has been replaced by an inner one, but the essential shape remains. Human beings are constrained below their true nature. The constraints were imposed by powerful beings. Knowledge is the key to loosening them. The great shift of the first millennium of the Common Era, the rise of Christianity and Islam as the dominant religious frameworks of the ancient Near East, and eventually of much of the world, covered the older traditions under layers of new theology and new practice, and new ways of understanding the human relationship with the divine. The Anunnaki were not named in these new frameworks. They were not acknowledged or engaged with. They were simply left behind, subsumed into the general category of pagan mythology, part of the vast archive of pre-Abrahamic religious thought that the new traditions regarded as superseded, as the mistaken beliefs of peoples who had not yet received the revelation that the new faiths claimed to carry. But even here, the tradition persisted in hidden forms. The esoteric dimensions of all three Abrahamic faiths, Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic Sufism, and the various mystical streams within Christianity, maintained practices and frameworks that bore unmistakable resemblance to the older Mesopotamian tradition. The Kabbalistic model of the human being as a microcosm of the divine structure, with specific centers of consciousness corresponding to divine attributes, was not invented by medieval Jewish mystics. It drew on a chain of transmission that reached back through the Hellenistic mystery schools, through the Babylonian tradition, to the original Sumerian understanding of the human body as a complex energetic system capable of perceiving and interacting with multiple levels of reality. The 9 Sephirot of the Kabbalistic tree of life, the 9 levels of the Sufi path, the 9 choirs of angels in the medieval Christian cosmological tradition. These ninefold structures appear too consistently across too many different traditions to be coincidental. They point back to something, some original model or original experience that generated the number 9 as significant. That organized understanding of the human system, or the cosmic system, or the relationship between them into 9 distinct components. Whether this original model was the Sumerian understanding of 9 specific capacities that had been dimmed in human beings, or whether it was something else entirely that simply resonated with the same fundamental structure, is a question that the available evidence does not definitively answer. But the resonance is there, and it is persistent, and it is worth sitting with. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and then to the early modern era, the recovery of ancient texts became a major intellectual project in Europe. The rediscovery of Greek philosophical texts, the translation of Arabic scientific and philosophical works, the gradual piecing together of the history of the ancient Near East from the classical sources that had preserved fragments of it, all of this created a new appetite for the oldest layers of human knowledge. When cuneiform began to be deciphered in the 19th century and the actual texts of the Sumerians and Akkadians and Babylonians became readable for the first time in 2 millennia, the effect was electric. Here was a civilization older than anything previously known, richer and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, telling stories about gods and creation, and floods that resonated unmistakably with the stories preserved in the Bible and in Greek mythology and in the religious traditions of multiple cultures. The scholars who first translated these texts were careful, precise, committed to accuracy. They noted the parallels with later traditions. They debated their interpretation. They published their findings in academic journals and presented them at learned societies, and argued with each other about questions of philology and dating, and the relationship between different textual traditions. This was the appropriate academic response to a set of extraordinary discoveries. But it was not the only possible response. There was also a popular response, less careful, less precise, more willing to leap from the evidence to conclusions that the evidence could not quite support, but also more alive to the emotional and experiential dimensions of what had been found. The 20th century saw an explosion of popular interest in the Anunnaki tradition, that went far beyond what mainstream scholarship either supported or was comfortable with. Writers and researchers operating outside the academic mainstream proposed readings of the ancient texts that took them with a kind of radical literalism that professional scholars rejected, but that nevertheless captured the imagination of millions of people who felt that the standard historical and religious accounts of human origins were incomplete, that something important was missing, that the ancient traditions were pointing towards something real that the established frameworks were not equipped to see. Whether these popular readings are accurate in their specifics is a question we need not resolve tonight. What is more interesting and more relevant to the story we are telling is the fact that they struck such a deep chord, that millions of people, reading about the Anunnaki and the creation of humanity and the limitation of human capacities, felt not curiosity but recognition, felt not that they were learning something new but that they were remembering something old, felt, in other words, exactly what the ancient Sumerian wisdom texts describe, the wistfulness of the post-diluvian scribe who reads about a time when human beings could perceive and do what he himself cannot perceive or do, and feels the distance between that description and his own experience as a kind of ache. That ache is itself a form of knowledge. It is the form that the tradition of the 9 diminished capacities takes, in a mind that has lost conscious access to the tradition, but not the underlying memory that generated it. You feel something is missing without knowing what it is. You sense that the world is more than it appears without being able to say how you know this. You reach for something just beyond the edge of your perception and find it sliding away before you can quite grasp it. You have moments, in the early morning or the late evening or in the middle of some ordinary task when your attention drops below its usual level and something else comes through briefly before the ordinary mind reasserts itself and covers it over again. These moments are the thin crack in the sealed door, the dim glow of the banked coals, the seed in the winter soil feeling the first warmth of spring working its way down through the frozen layers. They are real. They are not products of imagination or wishful thinking. They are glimpses of what the tradition says was once a continuous condition, a steady state of richer perception and fuller connection that the Anunnaki, in their wisdom, or their caution, or their need to maintain the particular kind of order they had established, decided must be reduced to these brief, elusive, often disbelieved moments of wider seeing. But the tradition also insists, in nearly every form it takes across nearly every culture that preserves it, that the reduction was not permanent, that the seals can be loosened, that the capacities are not gone but dormant, that the right conditions, the right disciplines, the right quality of attention sustained over the right period of time can restore some portion of what was taken, can open the door a little wider, can allow the lamp to burn a little brighter, not perhaps to the full brightness of the original, not in a single lifetime or through any technique that promises quick results, but genuinely, incrementally, in ways that are real and verifiable and that make a difference not just in the inner experience of the practitioner, but in how they move through the world and what effect they have on the people and places around them. This is the quiet hope that runs beneath the long story of the Anunnaki and the 9 diminished capacities. Not that human beings will suddenly recover some lost superpower, not that the gods will return and restore what they took, but that in each generation, in each person who takes the inner work seriously, who sits in the darkness before dawn and breathes in the pattern that has been passed down across centuries, who extends their attention outward carefully and patiently into the fabric of the living world, who maintains the disciplines of stillness and presence and genuine inquiry without demanding immediate results, something shifts, something loosens. A little more light comes through the cracked door, and the tradition suggests that this is enough, that this is perhaps exactly what was intended. Not a sudden restoration, but a gradual one, unfolding across generations at exactly the pace that human beings are ready for it, moving forward one careful practitioner at a time, one moment of genuine perception at a time, one small restoration of a capacity that has been sleeping for a very long time. The rivers of Mesopotamia still flow between their banks, the Tigris and the Euphrates moving south toward the sea as they have always moved, carrying in their waters the silt of the mountains and the dissolved memories of everything that has happened on their banks across all the millennia of human presence. The ancient cities are mounds of earth now, tells rising from the flat plain, their contents returning slowly to the soil from which they were made. The tablets that survived are in museums in London and Paris and Baghdad and New York, lying in climate-controlled cases or in storage drawers, their cuneiform signs still clear after 4,000 years, patient as only fired clay can be patient, waiting still. In the landscape around the ancient mounds, the farmers who work the fields are the descendants, in the most literal genetic sense, of the people who first worked those fields, who first dug the irrigation channels, who first pressed seed into the dark soil and waited for the rain and watched the stars for signs of what was coming. They do not know the names of the Anunnaki. They do not read cuneiform, but in the way they listen to the weather, in the way they read the soil, in the way they pay attention to the behavior of animals and the quality of light, and the small signals that the land sends to anyone who has spent enough time with it, something of the old attentiveness persists, dimmed, certainly, not what it was, but present. The 9 capacities that the Anunnaki are said to have reduced are not historical curiosities. They are descriptions of what is still, right now, in you, in the subtle body that you carry through your days, in the perceptual apparatus that operates mostly below the threshold of ordinary awareness, in the reaching toward meaning that is one of the most consistently human things about human beings across every culture and every century. The ancient tradition sees not failure or limitation or original sin, but a temporarily reduced signal strength, a bandwidth that was narrowed deliberately, and that can be, has been, and continues to be incrementally restored by those who are willing to do the patient interior work of restoration. This is not a promise of magic. It is not a guarantee of enlightenment or superhuman capability. It is simply what the oldest written tradition in the world, the tradition of the Anunnaki and the Sumerian creation stories and the tablets of the ancient scribes, has to say about what you are and what you might become. That you are made from divine material, that certain capacities built into that material were sealed down for reasons that made sense in the logic of the beings who sealed them, that the seals are not unbreakable, and that the work of loosening them, quiet and incremental and mostly invisible from the outside, is the most ancient and most consistently reported form of spiritual practice in human history. The star that rises over the eastern horizon in the hour before dawn is the same star that the Sumerian astronomer priests watched from the tops of their ziggurats 4,000 years ago. It has not changed. The light it sends across the vast distance between itself and the earth where you rest right now has crossed that same distance uncounted trillions of times since the first human eyes opened and looked up at the night sky and wondered what it meant. The wondering is still there. The reaching is still there. The capacity to be moved by the enormity of the night sky, to feel yourself simultaneously very small and part of something very large, is still there. It did not go away. It was perhaps the one capacity that even the Anunnaki could not quite seal, the one thread that remained uncut through all the centuries of dimming and forgetting. Because wondering is where it begins. Wondering is the first loosening of the sealed door. Wondering is the breath that disturbs the ash covering the banked coals and lets the air reach the heat beneath and starts the slow brightening that, given time and patience, might become a fire again. The story of the Anunnaki and the 9 diminished capacities has been told now, as fully as a single night's telling allows. The ancient plain is quiet, the rivers move in their channels, the tells rise from the flat earth under the stars, and the fired clay lies in its museum drawers, patient and permanent, carrying within it the pressed record of everything the ancient world understood about what human beings are and what we once were and what, in the deepest and most patient part of ourselves, we may yet become again. Let your breathing slow now, and let the images of the ancient world settle, gently like dust after a long journey. Let the rivers continue their movement in the dark behind your closed eyes, the wide flat plain stretching away in every direction beneath the enormous sky. Let the stars do what stars have always done, burn steadily in their appointed places, indifferent to empires and their endings, indifferent to the rising and falling of civilizations, indifferent to everything except the long, patient fact of their own light moving outward through the dark in every direction at once, reaching everything, touching everything, arriving at your window just as it arrives everywhere else, unhurried and undiminished. The same soil that held the tablets holds the roots of the date palms that still grow along the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The same water that carried the silt in which the first cities were built moves through those same channels tonight, a little differently routed, a little differently managed, but the same water, the same minerals, the same dissolved memories of everything the river has touched across all its centuries of flowing. Rest now. Let the fan turn softly. Let the air in the room settle around you. Let the weight of your body sink deeper into whatever supports it, and let the small persistent urgencies of the day release their hold on your attention, one by one, like birds lifting from a wire in the evening, one and then another, and then the last, until the wire is empty and the sky is clear and there is nothing left to hold on to, and nowhere left to go except deeper into this particular darkness, this particular silence, this particular moment of rest that is yours and no one else's. The Anunnaki, if they watch still from whatever realm they inhabit now, watch everything. They watch the rivers, they watch the ruins of their cities, they watch the tablets in their museum drawers, and they watch you, resting in your room in whatever corner of the world you have made your home, with the same patient attention they have always brought to the observation of human beings, waiting, as they have always waited, for the moment when enough of the sealed capacity has been restored, enough of the dimmed perception has brightened, enough of the forgotten knowledge has been remembered, that the relationship between the human and the divine can take the next step in its long, unhurried, incomprehensively patient unfolding. Sleep now. The night is deep and the world is quiet, and the stars burn on in their ancient places, steady and generous with their light, asking nothing in return except that you occasionally look up and wonder. Rest easy, knowing that what was sealed was not destroyed, that what was dimmed still glows in the deep places of your own being, and that tomorrow, as it always has, will arrive with its own quiet possibilities, its own small openings, its own patient invitation to see a little more clearly than you did the day before.